Hi guys, and welcome to Last Light Radio Channel. Tonight we step into a winter evening on the American frontier, where the snow is already swallowing the path behind you, and the cabin ahead looks less like a home than a dare. What did it really mean to survive here? With no furnace humming, no grocery shelf waiting, and no cheerful little thermostat pretending it had everything under control, you stand in the fading light with the trees creaking around you, your boots stiff with frost, and the whole land seems to be holding its breath. Inside that rough shelter, warmth is precious, food is uncertain, and every small comfort has to be earned the hard way. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and while you're here, comment with your location and your local time. Now, dim the lights, and you step toward the cabin with your shoulders tight against the wind, feeling the first true lesson of frontier winter settle onto your skin. The air bites at your cheeks at once. It is not the playful cold of a quick walk outside. It is a patient, serious cold that presses through wool, through linen, through every hopeful layer, until it reaches the body underneath and introduces itself properly. The trees around the clearing stand dark and still, their branches coated in pale frost, and the last trace of daylight lies low on the horizon, like a thought already fading. You smell wood smoke before you touch the latch, and that smell alone feels almost miraculous. The cabin is smaller than you imagined. People often picture frontier life as wide skies and open land, which is true right up until you must spend winter in a single room with your family, your tools, your bedding, your food stores, and probably a draft or two that behave like permanent house guests. The walls are built from logs hewn by hand, fitted together as well as time and labour allowed. In many regions, the gaps between those logs were packed with clay, mud, straw, or moss in a process called chinking. It helped. Certainly, it did not perform magic. When you push open the door, the warmth that reaches you is uneven and smoky, but it is still the most welcome thing in the world. The firelight flickers across the room, colouring the logs gold and amber, while the corners remain dusky and indistinct. Your boots scrape across the puncheon floor, made from split logs flattened on one side. It feels hard and slightly uneven beneath your feet. Every surface announces itself by touch. Rough wall, rough bench, rough table. Frontier design was not big on luxury. It was very committed to honesty. You pause just inside and let your eyes adjust. A bed frame stands against one wall, topped with rope supports or wooden slats and layered with whatever bedding the household can spare. A trundle or tick mattress stuffed with straw or corn husks may lie nearby. Pegs hold garments, bags, and tools. A chest sits under the window, if there is a proper window at all. Many cabins had small openings covered with greased paper instead of glass, letting in a weak, cloudy light. Glass was expensive and difficult to replace. The frontier was full of ways to remind you that convenience had not yet arrived. The sound inside the cabin is its own strange world. The fire snaps and settles. Iron shifts softly in the heat. Someone moves a kettle, and it gives a dull ring. Wind brushes along the outer wall with a low, steady murmur. From the roof comes the occasional whisper of snow sliding a little and stopping. You hear breathing, fabric rustling, a stool leg dragging. The noises are close, intimate, impossible to ignore. In a one-room cabin, privacy is less a reality than a rumour. You begin to understand that winter changes everything about how space is used. In warmer weather, much of life happens outdoors. Chores spread across the yard. Food can be cooked or prepared in open air. People can separate from one another without ceremony. But when winter settles in, the whole rhythm of existence compresses. You cook here, mend here, eat here, rest here, recover here, and sometimes feel mildly annoyed here while trying not to say so aloud. The cabin becomes a world in miniature, and every inch matters. The smell is layered and thick. Wood smoke rests over everything, settling into cloth, hair, and blankets until it becomes part of the household itself. Beneath it, you catch the scent of drying leather, damp wool, ash, and the faint sourness of stored food. Cornmeal has its own dusty odour. Salt pork adds a heavier note. If animal skins are curing nearby, the smell can be stronger still. Frontier winters were not scented with pine and cinnamon, unless someone was being unusually lucky. Most days, they smelled like effort. You take off your outer things carefully, because wet fabric near freezing weather is a quiet enemy. A cloak or shawl may be shaken free of snow and hung close enough to the hearth to dry, though not so close that a spark finds it first. Your fingers sting as they warm. That tingling, half painful, half relieving sensation creeps through them while you hold your hands near the flames. Not too near, never too near. Fire is life here, but it is also danger. Historians still argue how often cabin fires destroyed homes compared with other winter hazards, because records from isolated settlements were uneven, but everyone understood the risk without needing a chart. The cabin itself is part shelter, part compromise. Many frontier families built quickly because they had little choice. A first cabin might go up in a matter of days, meant to be good enough before it was truly good. Speed mattered. Snow did not wait for craftsmanship. Some cabins were built from round logs, others from squared timbers, depending on skill, tools, and local wood. Floors were sometimes bare earth at first, though puncheon floors were preferred when labour allowed. Even a simple shutter over an opening could make the difference between misery and slightly less misery, which on the frontier counted as a meaningful improvement. You move nearer the hearth and feel how dramatically the room changes within a few steps. One side of your face warms, while the other still senses a draught slipping down from some invisible crack. That is winter cabin life in one sensation. Warmth and chill together. Comfort and discomfort holding hands like reluctant cousins at a family gathering. The fire does not fill the room evenly. It claims a territory. Outside that circle, the air cools fast. The people around you carry themselves with the economy of those who know exactly how much work remains. No gesture is wasted. A woman at the kettle checks it with practiced attention, adjusting its position by inches. A man near the door brushes snow from a tool and leans it where it can dry. A child sits on a low stool, half drowsy, half fascinated by the flames. On many frontiers, families included not just parents and children, but sometimes grandparents, hired hands, boarders, or travellers passing through. Space was negotiated constantly. Personal boundaries were mostly theoretical. You notice clothing first by texture. Wool stockings, linen shifts, heavy skirts, coarse shirts, buckskin in some places, homespun fabric if the household spun and wove its own textiles, which many did. Fabric was valuable, clothing was patched repeatedly, and garments often served until they were one determined sneeze away from becoming rags. The idea of a separate winter wardrobe in the modern sense would seem almost comic here. You wore what you had, layered what you could, and thanked heaven for every mitten that still had both a thumb and a future. Outside, twilight fades fully. The dark on the frontier is not gentle. It arrives with depth. Once the light goes, the clearing becomes a black field edged by blacker trees, and the cabin stands like a small lantern in an ocean of cold. You might think the night would feel peaceful, and sometimes it does. Yet peace is never the only feeling. There is alertness in it too. You listen for the weather. You listen for branches breaking under snow. You listen, sometimes, for wolves. Though their threat to people was often exaggerated in later storytelling, the more common menace was exposure, hunger, or illness, which are far less dramatic and much ruder. A mainstream truth of frontier winter is that survival depended on preparation made months earlier. Firewood had to be cut, split, and stacked in astonishing quantities. Food had to be dried, smoked, salted, stored, or otherwise preserved before cold weather closed the roads and emptied the fields. Water might need to be hauled through snow or broken from ice. Candles had to be made or precious lamp fuel guarded carefully. Nothing appeared by accident. Every comfort in the room represents labour already spent. Yet there were odd and memorable details too. In some cabins, people placed heated stones or bricks wrapped in cloth into beds before sleep. It was a humble luxury, a little pocket of mercy against sheets cold enough to make a saint complain. Another curious practice involved using a bed warmer. A long-handled pan filled with hot coals, passed briefly between the blankets. Effective. Yes. Slightly alarming. Also, yes. Frontier life often solved one problem by introducing a smaller, more manageable problem with a handle. You move toward the table and run your fingers over the wood. It is nicked and burnished from use. This surface has seen bread dough, mending, seed sorting, letter writing, shaving. Maybe a child learning to spell with a blunt bit of charcoal. A frontier cabin table is never just a table. It is a workshop, schoolroom, sickbed support, dining place, and witness. The same goes for nearly every object here. Multi-purpose living was not a trend. It was survival wearing an apron. At the far side of the room, a draft touches your ankle. You look down and see where the wall meets the floor. No matter how carefully a cabin was built, Winter had a genius for finding the smallest openings. Moss stuffed in gaps could shrink. Clay could crack. A door could warp. Snow might drift against the outside and block some wind, then melt and leave damp behind. The frontier cabin asked for constant maintenance, even while the people inside were already tired, especially then. Scholars still debate how much comfort varied between regions and families, because the word frontier covers a vast range of places, climates, traditions, and resources. A cabin in Kentucky did not feel exactly like one in Minnesota. A household with livestock, good hunting, and strong community ties might endure winter very differently from an isolated family with fewer tools and weaker harvests. Even so, certain realities repeat across the record. Space was tight, cold was persistent, work was endless, and people adapted with a mixture of skill, stubbornness, and the occasional dark joke. That joke might come at the door, where a crust of ice has formed around the latch, or at the chimney, which smokes badly if the wind changes, or at the sight of a treasured candle burning faster than anyone would like. You can imagine someone muttering that winter has come to visit and, naturally, intends never to leave. Humour on the frontier was often dry, understated, and suspiciously familiar with disappointment. It had to be. Complaining without collapsing was practically a household art. The fire pops suddenly, throwing a spark onto the hearthstone. For a moment every face turns. Then the tension passes. Someone shifts a log deeper into the flames. The kettle breathes a ribbon of steam. A spoon stirs thick contents with a slow scrape. You realise how much of winter life begins with attention. Small checks, small corrections, small precautions. Nothing is casual because the stakes are not casual. You sit at last, feeling the stiffness leave your legs in stages. The bench is unforgiving, but after the cold outside it seems generous enough. Heat touches one side of your boots. The leather softens a little. Your nose still carries the smell of snow from outside, that faint clean scent that feels almost empty compared with the rich, smoky air within. The contrast is striking. Outside is vast, silent, and indifferent. Inside is cramped, noisy, and intensely human. This is the first truth of a frontier cabin in winter. It is not a charming postcard. It is a machine for staying alive, assembled from timber, labour, memory, and hope. The people inside it do not merely pass the season. They bargain with it every day. They count supplies. They guard flame. They patch, stack, stir, lift, scrape, and wait. And as the wind presses at the logs and darkness settles fully around the clearing, you feel the strange comfort of that small room more deeply than ever. It is fragile, smoky, crowded, imperfect, and precious. In the heart of winter, that is more than enough. Morning comes slowly in the cabin, not with bright sunshine pouring through clean glass, but with a grey, uncertain light that slips through a small window opening and settles across the room like cold dust. You wake before you fully want to, because winter has its own schedule and it does not care about your preferences. The air beyond the blankets feels sharp enough to flinch from. For a few still moments, you stay where you are, listening. The cabin has a dawn voice that is different from its night voice. The fire is quieter now, reduced to a low red bed with the occasional soft click of settling ash. Someone nearby coughs into the crook of an arm. Wood creaks as the outside cold tightens its grip on the logs. A faint gust presses along the wall and finds its way through some narrow seam, brushing your face with a thread of chill. The room smells of embers, wool, and human sleep. There is also the dry, grassy scent of mattress stuffing, and the faint animal note that clings to leather boots left near the hearth. You shift under the blankets and feel every layer, a coverlet, a rough wool blanket, perhaps a quilt if the household is fortunate. Bedding on the frontier was treasured, worked hard, and rarely ample enough for anyone's ideal. Mattresses were often simple ticks filled with straw, corn husks, cattail fluff, or feathers if luck and means allowed. Featherbeds did exist and were prized, but not every family had one, and even a good featherbed could flatten, lump, or gather damp in unpleasant ways. There is a modern myth that all pioneer cabins were filled with sweet rustic comfort. You would like to invite that myth to lie down on a straw tick in January and report back honestly. Getting dressed is its own small trial. Clothes left off the body overnight carry the room's cold, and each layer touches your skin with a kind of stern authority. You pull on stockings, petticoat or trousers, shirt, stays or suspenders, outer dress or overshirt, whatever garments belong to your role in the household, and each piece feels practical before it feels comfortable. Fabric rubs at the wrists, seams press against the shoulder, wool scratches a little, then a little less as your body heat slowly persuades it to cooperate. Frontier people were deeply familiar with textures. Survival was always in contact with the skin. The first person up crosses to the hearth and kneels near the ashes with a care that almost looks ceremonial. It is not ceremony, of course. It is skill. Banking a fire overnight was a common practice, covering live coals with ash to preserve enough heat for morning rekindling. When it works, it saves time, fuel, and trouble. When it fails, the entire household begins the day with cold fingers and private resentment. A bit of tinder is tucked in, a breath is blown low and steady. Another tiny sound comes from the hearth, then a glow, then the thin crackle of new flame taking hold. That sound is better than birdsong. Soon the room changes, not quickly, never quickly, but enough. A little light from the fire washes the nearest wall. The iron crane or hook above the hearth is moved. A pot is set on. Water begins its slow climb toward warmth. The work of morning starts at once, because winter does not allow a lazy drift into the day. There is too much to do simply to keep the household running. You can almost measure the character of the season by how few tasks are optional. The cabin in full daylight reveals its flaws without embarrassment. The chinking between the logs is cracked in one place and patched in another. The floor shows muddy boot marks that can never quite be kept away in bad weather. Soot has darkened the stones near the chimney. A stool has one leg slightly shorter than the others, giving it a thoughtful wobble. The walls are hung with things that matter more than decoration. A kettle, a ladle, a rifle if the family owns one, bundles of dried herbs, a string of onions, a harness strap, a bag of meal tied high to keep it safe from damp or pests. On the frontier, beauty and usefulness often had to share the same chair. You go to the door and lift the latch just enough to peer out. The world beyond the threshold looks transformed and slightly unreal. Snow lies over the clearing in broad, pale folds, touched blue where the morning shadows hold. Smoke climbs from the chimney and flattens in the wind. The trees are silent, but not empty. You see tracks crossing the edge of the yard, maybe rabbit, maybe fox. The air that comes through the opening smells clean enough to sting, with a trace of sap and distant pine. It is beautiful in the way dangerous things often are, very calm until you must stand in them for long. The door closes quickly. You feel no shame in that decision. Breakfast begins as an exercise in economy. Food is not arranged for pleasure first. It is chosen for what remains, what keeps, what can be spared, and what gives enough strength for the next round of labour. Cornmeal mush or johnny cakes may appear. Salt pork might be sliced. There may be leftover beans or a heel of coarse bread. In some regions there could be hominy, dried apples stewed soft, or a little molasses if stores have held. Coffee was not always available, and many households relied on substitutes made from roasted grains or roots. Chicory had its place, so did disappointment. The smell of breakfast fills the room with a plain, comforting richness. Steam from the pot carries warmth upward, dampening the dry bite of the cabin air. Grease hisses faintly in a pan. A wooden spoon scrapes the side of a kettle with a repetitive, familiar rhythm. Hunger sharpens the senses. Even simple food feels generous when the weather outside has the manners of a tax collector. You eat close to the fire because everything happens close to the fire. Bowls warm your hands. The spoon is smooth where many fingers have held it. Salt, if present, is used carefully. So is sugar. So is everything worth having. On the American frontier, preserved pork and corn were staple winter foods in many settlements, especially in regions where those crops and animals could be raised reliably. Venison, squirrel, rabbit, beans, turnips, pumpkins, and dried fruits might round out the table depending on place and season. Diet changed by geography, culture, and income. But the common thread was plain enough. Winter meals had a job to do. There is a quirky little truth tucked inside these breakfasts. Some households made use of burnt bread crust, parched corn, or roasted acorns in various ways when preferred supplies were short. You learn quickly that frontier cooking contains an entire philosophy of making peace with substitutes. Scholars still disagree on how often some of these improvisations were used in ordinary households, and how often they were remembered later because they sounded especially dramatic. People do tend to save the stranger stories. Still, necessity was inventive, and the frontier had no patience for fussy appetites. After eating, the room no longer feels like a place of waking alone. It becomes a workplace. Morning light strengthens just enough to help, though the cabin remains dim compared with any modern room. Winter sun through greased paper or small panes does not do much heavy lifting. You notice how important placement is. The table sits where daylight is best. Mending is brought near the window. Fine tasks are timed for the brighter hours. A person who wastes winter light wastes more than light. Now the daily contest with the cabin itself begins. Moisture must be managed. Wet mittens need drying. Melted snow tracked inside must be wiped away before it turns the floor slick or soaks into something valuable. Ash must be carried out. Fresh wood must be brought in, though not so much that it clutters the room. The bed covering may be thrown back for a while to let dampness escape. Airing bedding was a sensible practice when weather permitted, because stale bedding could collect moisture, smells, and unwelcome guests of the tiny biting variety. Frontier domestic life contained many battles too small for monuments. You take up a broom made from bundled twigs or corn husks and sweep the floor. The sound is dry and steady, rasping over the boards in quick strokes. Dust rises a little in the slant light, smelling of ash, old wood, and earth. Sweeping is not glamorous, but it is constant. Cabins gather dirt with impressive dedication. Soot drifted. Boots shed mud. Food preparation left crumbs. Children, being children across all centuries, contributed with cheerful consistency. Someone at the table turns to mending, a stocking with a worn heel, a shirt with a split seam, a mitten losing the argument at one fingertip. Needlework in winter was as necessary as chopping wood, just performed with less noise. Thread mattered, scraps mattered. An old garment might be remade into a smaller one, then cut down again for patches, then finally become a rag. Cloth was not casually thrown away. Every inch had another possible life waiting inside it. The cabin grows warmer by degrees, but never fully warm. That is one of the hardest realities to understand from a distance. Even with a fire going well, much of the room remains cool, and the edges of the building can feel almost refrigerated. Frost may gather on the inside near nails, iron, or thin openings. Water in a basin can turn icy overnight. A metal spoon left in the wrong place can shock your fingers. There is no stable comfort, only temporary islands of it. You sit for a moment near the wall and lay your palm against the log. The wood feels cold through the surface, as if the forest has not entirely agreed to become a house. That sensation lingers in your mind. These walls were once living trees, and now they stand between your body and a season willing to take anything not firmly defended. Cabin life in winter is full of that intimate awareness. The outside world is near. It is never fully shut out. It waits at every seam. By mid-morning, the household has found its rhythm. A child may recite letters or simple sums if anyone has time to teach. A man might repair a harness, shape a peg, or shave kindling. A woman may spin, card wool, stir a pot, and supervise everything else at once, which is less an exaggeration than a frontier expectation. Labour was divided by age, gender, culture, and circumstance, but nearly everyone worked. Even small children could fetch chips, twist yarn, or shell corn. Winter did not create idleness. It merely moved the labour indoors. There is a common historical image of frontier women spending long winters only sewing by the fire, and while sewing certainly happened, that picture is too narrow to be fair. Women often managed food stores, prepared meals, cared for the sick, washed clothes when possible, tended children, made candles or soap, spun fibre, patched tools, and kept the household functioning under relentless pressure. Men were often outside with wood, livestock repairs, hunting, hauling, and heavy tasks, though indoor work also fell to them when weather demanded. The cabin blurred neat categories. Whoever saw a need usually met it. At some point you hear it. A small, irregular tapping overhead. Snow slipping from the roof, a branch brushing the eaves, a squirrel making bold assumptions. The sounds of a cabin keep everyone alert. A chimney that draws poorly, a leak in the roof, a shutter banging loose. All must be noticed early. People on the frontier developed a practical listening habit. Every odd noise had to be sorted into harmless, troublesome, or urgent. One quirky tidbit from some settlements might surprise you. In especially cold places, chamber pots could freeze solid enough overnight to require creative handling in the morning, which is not the sort of detail romantic paintings usually volunteer. History is very selective in its flirting. Real winter life had frozen laundry, stiff boots, numb ears, smoky rafters, and a startling number of tasks involving the words scrape, haul, wring, and thaw. By late morning, the cabin smells less like sleep and more like occupation. Warm grain, hot iron, damp wool drying near the fire, a trace of animal tallow from candles or grease, smoke, always smoke, hanging above it all and settling invisibly into cloth and hair. You inhale and feel that this air would become recognizable anywhere. A frontier cabin had its own atmosphere, literally and otherwise. You could probably find your household in the dark by scent alone. You stand again near the fire and look around the room with a clearer eye than when you first woke. It is not merely small, it is intensely organized by necessity. Every object has a place because there is no room for laziness in placement. Every corner holds some answer to winter's demands. A pile of split wood, a stack of bowls, a folded blanket, a sack of meal, a line where herbs are drying, a peg reserved for the outdoor coat. Life here is not spacious, but it is exact. And beneath all the chores, the textures, the smells, and the practical improvisations, another feeling settles in. It is not comfort exactly. It is competence, or the beginning of it. You learn the way the room behaves with daylight. You learn which floorboard catches the toe, which wall leaks the worst draught, which patch of hearth gives the best heat for warming hands, and how quickly the room slips back toward cold when the fire is neglected. The cabin teaches by contact. Every morning lesson is physical. Every lesson matters. By afternoon, the cabin has narrowed itself around the hearth until the fire seems less like an object and more like the household's second heart. You feel it before you look at it. A pulse of heat against your shins, a dry pressure on your face, a constant demand on your attention. Out on the frontier, winter teaches you something very quickly. A fire is never just a pleasant glow. It is cooking, drying, warming, lighting, and protection bundled into one restless patch of flame. You kneel near the hearth and begin to understand how much knowledge hides in a pile of wood. Not every log behaves the same. Some pieces catch quickly and flare bright. Others burn slow and stubborn, releasing a deeper heat once they are fully going. Greenwood hisses and sulks. Seasoned wood answers like an old friend. Oak, hickory, maple, ash, pine. Each has a different temperament, and people learn them the way sailors learn winds. A frontier family that knows its wood well is a family with better odds of comfort, or at least slightly fewer dramatic sighs before supper. The stack by the wall is arranged with practical intelligence. Thin kindling lies nearest the hearth, dry and easy to reach. Splits of medium size wait behind it. Heavier logs stand farther back, precious in their density, meant for longer stretches of heat. You run your fingers over the grain and feel splinters lifting like tiny needles. The bark smells sharp and earthy. Some pieces still carry a faint trace of the forest, as if snow and moss had only just left them. Others smell dry as dust, ready to vanish into flame with little complaint. Wood gathering was one of the great frontier obsessions of autumn, and for good reason. Historians agree that households needed astonishing amounts of fuel to survive a hard winter, though exact estimates varied by climate, cabin size, and the efficiency of the hearth. People cut, hauled, split, and stacked for months, and still there was always the uneasy question of whether enough had been laid by. Enough is a dangerous word in winter. It sounds solid. It rarely feels solid. You watch the person tending the fire work with a calm economy that borders on art. A stick is nudged here. A coal is pulled forward there. A log is set, not thrown, angled so air can slip beneath. The poker scrapes the hearthstone with a sound both harsh and comforting. Sparks rise in a tiny golden swarm, then disappear into the dim space above. Nothing about this work is casual. A poorly managed fire wastes wood. A sluggish fire smokes. A fast. Greedy one eats fuel and leaves the room cold again too soon. The hearth itself is broad, blackened, and busy. Iron hooks hang inside. A crane may swing out and in. Pots sit at different distances from the coals depending on what is needed. A kettle hums lightly as it warms. A spider skillet rests over heat enough for frying. In some cabins, bread bakes in a Dutch oven with coals piled above and below. Cooking here depends on judgment, not knobs. You learn to read heat by the colour of coals, by the speed of steam, by the way your hand feels at a certain distance. It is skill built through burns, guesses, and repetition. Smoke is the fire's rude companion. Even when the chimney draws well, a cabin rarely escapes it entirely. It clings to rafters, darkens logs, settles into cloth, and follows you into sleep. When the wind shifts or the chimney grows sluggish, smoke can roll back into the room in a grey sulk that stings the eyes and catches the throat. You blink and cough and wave it away with a hand, as if dignity alone might persuade it to leave. It does not. Smoke had frontier manners, which is to say almost none. Almost. The smell of the hearth changes through the day. At one moment it is bright and resinous from fresh kindling. Later it turns deeper, with the dry sweetness of seasoned hardwood. Then come the added notes of cooking fat, scorched iron, warm broth, damp mittens steaming on a peg, and wool gloves left just close enough to dry without becoming a cautionary tale. Every fire writes its own weather inside the room. You notice how all movement bends toward heat. Wet boots are placed nearby. Frozen fingers are held out toward the blaze. A pot of water sits where it can warm for washing or tea. A child drifts close without realizing it, drawn by instinct and comfort. Even the cat, if there is one, finds the exact patch where the floor carries warmth from the stones beneath. There is no democracy in the placement of furniture on a winter day. The fire decides the geography. Keeping that fire alive is constant labour. Someone must carry in wood again. Someone must split smaller pieces when the pile of kindling runs low. Someone must knock loose the ash that is built too thick and smothers the breath of the coals. Someone must watch for sparks leaping where they should not. You begin to see why the hearth was often called the centre of the home. Not in a sentimental embroidered pillow sort of way, in a literal way. The cabin rotates around it like a planet trying not to freeze. There is a harsh truth tucked inside that warmth. Fire consumes. Every glowing log once represented swinging an axe in cold air, hauling weight over uneven ground, bending, stacking, lifting, splitting, repeating. When a chunk of oak catches and collapses into red light, You're watching labour turn into heat. That knowledge gives every flame a certain gravity. Nothing in the cabin feels free. Heat least of all. A quirky detail from frontier life might make you smile, though perhaps from a safe distance. In some households, especially where there were children or impatient adults, toes were dried so aggressively at the hearth that boots shrank, leather cracked, or stockings scorched. The line between comfort and disaster was very fine. Fire warmed the body, cooked the meal, and now and then tried to eat the equipment. It kept everyone humble. You crouch lower and study the coal bed. The colour is astonishing. Not merely red, but layers of orange, crimson, soft white, and almost purple shadow between. The surface seems still until it suddenly shifts and breathes inward, exposing a brighter core. Heat touches your face so strongly that the skin across your cheeks tightens. Your hands feel dry at once. The front of your body warms while your back reminds you that the room beyond the hearth remains cool. This double sensation never quite stops feeling strange. Some families used fire in ingenious little ways beyond the obvious. Flat irons could be heated near the coals for pressing clothing or smoothing seams. Water stones might be warmed for aching joints. Soap making, candle dipping, rendering fat. All demanded reliable heat at the right moment. In harsh weather, even a simple bucket of water set near the hearth could save time later by keeping it from freezing solid. The fire's usefulness extended into every corner of domestic life, yet the scholarly picture is not perfectly settled. Researchers still debate how comfortable winter heating truly was in ordinary cabins, because surviving accounts can be uneven. Memoirs written later in life sometimes soften hardships into nostalgia, while other accounts may emphasize suffering for dramatic effect. The truth, as usual, likely sat in the middle, shivering slightly. Some cabins were better built, better supplied, and better managed than others. Some families had skill and luck, others had one without the other. Winter was rarely fair about such distinctions. You hear the axe outside long before you see who is using it. A dull, rhythmic thock from the woodpile. Then a pause. Then another strike. The sound carries through the cold air and into the cabin with a curious reassurance. It means more fuel is being made ready. It means someone is thinking ahead. It means the evening has not been left to chance. On the frontier, the sound of chopping wood could soothe nerves in a way a lullaby never quite could. When the door opens, a burst of cold enters with the person carrying an armful of splits. Snow dust shines on their shoulders and melts almost at once near the hearth. Their gloves smell faintly of bark and iron. The room changes in an instant. For a few seconds the warm air recoils, then steadies again as the door shuts. Even this brief exchange reminds you how fragile indoor comfort is. The outside always has a way in. The fire simply argues back. Ash deserves more respect than it usually gets. It is not glamorous, but it is part of the entire system. Too much ash chokes the fire. The right amount can preserve heat overnight. Ash can be used in cleaning, in soap making, and in lye production. It coats the hearth in a soft grey layer that holds footprints, fallen embers, and bits of bark like a private record of the day's work. When you scoop it carefully into a metal container, you feel how deceptively alive it can remain. Grey does not always mean cold. Cooking over this fire means accepting uncertainty. A stew thickens too fast if the pot sits too near the heart of the heat. Bread bakes unevenly unless the coals are managed with patience. Meat can scorch outside while staying obstinately pale within. You learn to rotate, lift, shift, and wait. There is no timer chirping from a counter. There is only experience. Meals taste of smoke, iron, salt, and a little risk. They are excellent partly because failure was entirely possible. The light from the flames also shapes the mood of the room. In winter afternoons, when daylight starts fading absurdly early, the fire becomes the first answer to gathering dark. It throws moving patterns across the logs and makes every face look softer, stranger, more serious. Shadows rise behind stools and storage chests. A hand passing through the glow looks briefly golden. A kettle catches the light and shines like something far finer than it is. The hearth can make the cabin feel rich for a moment, though not in money. In presence. You sit close enough to hear sap snap inside one of the logs, a tiny pop. Then a brighter flare. Heat pushes against your knees. The smell of pitch fills the air. A bead of resin bubbles, blackens, and vanishes. The fire is always changing, always consuming itself to keep you alive. There is something solemn in that. Frontier people did not usually have the luxury of sitting around pondering symbolism, but that does not mean symbolism was absent. A household watching a winter hearth was watching endurance made visible. Children were often warned sternly about the dangers of the fire, and for good reason. Loose hems, curious fingers, and sudden stumbles did not mix well with open flames. Yet children also learned from the hearth early. They fetched chips, twisted paper, carried small sticks, and observed the logic of keeping coals alive. Fire safety and fire knowledge were taught not through pamphlets, but through close daily experience. It was education with very high stakes and absolutely no cheerful cartoon mascot. You begin to notice the temperature zones within the cabin with surprising precision. One step too close to the hearth and your skin prickles with dry heat. 2 steps back and the warmth becomes pleasant. Another 2, and the draft from the wall reminds you that winter is still in charge. Cooking places, mending places, warming places, all are chosen with care. Cats understand this immediately. Humans take a little longer, though generally with more opinions. There were also tricks for carrying heat beyond the hearth itself. Bricks or stones heated by the fire might be wrapped and tucked into bedding. A mug of hot broth could warm the hands long after the swallow was finished. A kettle kept near simmering gave off gentle moisture that softened the room's dry edge. Even bodies gathered closely in a small cabin created warmth. Crowding, inconvenient in summer, became a kind of seasonal technology. The fire shapes time as well as space. You feed it in the morning and judge what the day will require. You build it higher when damp clothes need drying. You bank it lower when wood must be conserved. Toward evening you begin calculating the night, choosing the pieces that will hold coals longest. That choice carries a quiet importance. A well-banked fire means a gentler dawn. A dead hearth at sunrise means stiff hands, colder breakfast, and a sharper start to the day. It is remarkable how much emotion can be attached to one stubborn coal. Somewhere in the room, an iron pot lid rattles as steam nudges beneath it. A ladle taps the rim. Someone shifts on a bench and stretches chilled feet toward the blaze. Outside, the wind brushes the cabin and moves on. Inside, the hearth answers with its own sound, a low, steady crackle, a breathing heat, a language of sparks and coals that everyone here understands. You may not know every frontier skill yet, but you know this much with complete certainty. The fire is not decoration. It is labor, meal, light, safety, and hope, all flickering in one place. As dusk thickens and the room leans ever more heavily on the hearth, you look into the coals and feel the strange comfort of dependence clearly. This flame asks something of you every hour. It never lets the household forget that warmth must be earned and guarded. But in return it offers one of winter's rarest gifts. It pushes back, against frozen air, against wet clothes, against darkness, against despair, sometimes. And in a frontier cabin while snow lies hard across the land, that patient, hungry, glowing resistance is as close to luxury as life gets. By the time supper is finished, the little cabin has entered the longest part of the day, though the clock would not necessarily agree. Winter darkness on the frontier has a way of stretching itself. It begins outside the walls, pooling under the trees and swallowing the yard. Then it presses against the window and the door, and finally it seems to settle inside the room itself, hiding in rafters and corners where the firelight cannot quite reach. You feel it not only with your eyes, but with your skin and nerves. Daylight asks things of you. Darkness asks different things. The cabin changes character after sunset. In the afternoon it is a workshop, a kitchen, a place of motion and duty. At night it becomes an island. The walls do not actually grow thicker, and yet the room feels more enclosed, more separate from the world beyond. The fire throws a wavering circle of amber over the floorboards. A candle flame, if one is spared, adds its own small trembling light. Everything outside that glow becomes suggestive rather than certain. A stool looks like a crouching figure until you look properly, A hanging coat seems to move when the light shifts. You would laugh at yourself, and perhaps you do, but only a little. This is one of the great truths of frontier winter. The night was genuinely dark in a way many modern people hardly encounter. There were no street lamps beyond the clearing, no neighbour's porch light glimmering through the trees, no electric glow beneath a doorframe. Moonlight and starlight could be strikingly beautiful, even bright on snow, but cloud cover erased much of that, leaving the land outside almost completely black. Once the cabin door shut, the family lived inside a small pocket of firelit certainty surrounded by enormous uncertainty. You move closer to the hearth without quite meaning to. The heat touches your face. Your hands smell faintly of dishwater, smoke, and coarse soap. The room carries the rich after scent of supper, with traces of broth, salt meat, onions, maybe corn cakes or beans, mixed into the everlasting perfume of ash and burning wood. Someone rinses a bowl in warm water and sets it aside with a soft wooden knock. Another person folds a cloth, wrings it once, and hangs it to dry. The ordinary sounds of evening grow more important in the dark. They reassure, they locate people. They say, quite plainly, "We are still here. Light itself must be managed carefully." Candles were useful, but they were not casually burned. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were common in many households, and often gave off a smell that was less romantic than practical. Beeswax candles burned cleaner and brighter, but they were more expensive and not always available. Some homes used lamps with whale oil, lard, or other fuels when they could. Each source of a light had its own cost, its own smell, and its own little inconvenience. Frontier evenings were full of calculations. Is this task worth a candle? Can it wait until morning? Does the fuel stretch another week? You begin to understand that even seeing well could be a luxury. A candle is lit at the table. Its flame wavers first, then steadies into a pale gold tongue. The tallow gives off a faint greasy odour, not unpleasant exactly, but plain and unmistakable. Light slides over the tabletop, catches the curve of a spoon, brightens a patch on the wall, then fades quickly. It does not transform the room into a cheerful chamber. It creates a second small island inside the first. Anyone working by it leans close, eyes narrow, fingers become careful. Shadows lengthen enormously behind the simplest objects. A hand-lifting thread can look 10 times its size on the wall. Many evening tasks continue by this modest light. Buttons are sewn back on, a strap is repaired, a bit of corn is shelled from the cob, a page is read if someone can read, and if the household owns a Bible, an almanac, a newspaper saved from town, or another precious scrap of print. Reading aloud was one of the small nighttime pleasures available in some cabins, though not in all. Books were valuable, literacy rates varied by region and background, and after a long day many people simply had too little light or too little energy for prolonged reading. Still, the sound of a voice reciting from the same page again and again could be a comfort as real as warmth. You notice how sound travels differently at night. Every creak of the cabin feels sharper. The chimney gives a low, shifting murmur. A log settles in the fire with a sudden crack that draws every eye. Outside, a gust moves through the trees and sets the branches rubbing together with a dry, distant complaint. Snow slipping from the roof makes a soft, rushing whisper that stops as quickly as it begins. You listen to the land without meaning to. At night there is less visual information, so the ears become ambitious. That sharpened listening could have practical value. People paid attention to weather sounds, to the direction of wind, to the rattle of loose shutters, to animals moving near the cabin, to the cry of livestock if they were kept close enough to hear. But it also had an emotional side. The frontier's night could feel deeply peaceful and faintly unnerving at the same time. You are protected, but only by a few inches of timber, and whatever skill built them. You are warm, but only in this limited circle of heat. Beyond the walls lies a darkness too large to measure from where you sit. There is a popular image of frontier evenings as endlessly cosy, all candle glow and gentle storytelling, and there is some truth tucked inside that picture. People did gather, mend, talk, sing, and share tales. Yet the coziness existed within conditions that were often physically draining. Feet hurt, shoulders ached, Smoke irritated the eyes. Children fussed. Elderly joints stiffened in the cold. The simple act of staying clean and dry took effort. Comfort was real, but it was handmade and often temporary. No one drifted into it by accident. A quirky little detail of cabin evenings appears in old recollections now and then. People sometimes used a splint or sliver of resinous wood as an extra source of light, especially in pine country. These fire-kindled strips could burn brightly enough for brief work, though they smoked and needed attention. Imagine trying to thread a needle by the flare of a small burning stick while the room smells of pitch and dinner and wet wool. History can be wonderfully undignified. You settle on a stool and let your eyes drift toward the window opening. If the night is clear and the moon is up, the snow outside may reflect a bluish light so soft it almost looks imagined. Trees stand like black cutouts against a pale sky. Smoke slides across the stars. If clouds have covered the moon, the opening becomes a dull patch and then almost nothing at all. Either way, the glass, greased paper, or shutter reminds you that night is pressing close. The frontier never really disappears after sunset. It simply becomes a presence you sense rather than see. Some evenings invite conversation more than others. A family might talk over practical matters, the weather, supplies, letters from distant relatives, plans for market, news brought by a traveller, a rumour of road conditions, or whether a neighbour's cow has calved. Small communities lived on shared information, and winter made information especially valuable. If heavy snow had blocked the pass, if sickness was spreading, if wolves were troubling stock, if a mill was closed, people wanted to know. Words by the hearth could be almost as useful as tools. Then there were stories, and those were useful too, though in a different way. Folk tales, family memories, scriptural retellings, hunting anecdotes, local legends, all could pass the evening with remarkable efficiency. Some stories soothed, others thrilled. A few perhaps should not have been told to children just before sleep, but frontier standards for bedtime ambiance were flexible. Ghost stories existed in many traditions, of course, and they had a special energy on winter nights when the candle guttered and something tapped lightly at the wall. It is possible that not every unexplained noise required a spirit. It is also possible that no one was especially eager to test that theory outdoors. Scholars still disagree about how much of later frontier storytelling reflects exact practice, and how much was embroidered in memory. 19th century recollections often polished the roughest edges of hardship into scenes of rustic charm, while other writers emphasized danger and loneliness to dramatic effect. The real evenings likely ranged widely. Some were companionable, some were tense, some were simply tiring. Human nature came to the frontier fully packed. As the room settles deeper into night, touch becomes more noticeable. The bench under you feels hard and slightly uneven. The knit in your stocking rasps against your ankle when you shift. A blanket laid over your lap carries the scratch of wool and the reassuring weight of warmth. Your palms, held toward the fire, first tingle and then grow dry. The bridge of your nose feels cool while your knees feel almost too hot. These little contradictions define the nighttime cabin. One part of the body is grateful, another part is complaining. Children begin to droop in stages. First comes the fidgeting, then the leaning, then the vague, glassy stare into the fire that suggests some dream has already started. An adult lifts a little one from the stool, and the child folds against a shoulder with that total trust tired children have possessed in every century. Small shoes thump softly onto the floor or are pulled off near the bed. Hair smells of smoke and sleep. A blanket is wrapped around thin shoulders and tucked close. In a one-room cabin, no one disappears into a distant nursery. The whole household witnesses the evening's surrender. The candle burns lower, a bead of melted tallow runs down one side and hardens. Shadows rise higher on the walls. The room is quieter now, though never silent. The fire still speaks in tiny snaps and sighs. Someone clears a throat. Cloth moves. The wind goes around the cabin again and finds a different crack this time, making a faint whistle that lasts only a few seconds. You learn that nighttime calm on the frontier is never absolute. It is stitched together from many small sounds. Outside noises could be interpreted with varying degrees of accuracy. A scratching at the wall might be a branch, a mouse, or loose bark shifting with the wind. Hoof sounds in the yard might belong to livestock moving restlessly, or to a late traveller, or simply to your imagination doing excellent work under terrible supervision. The mind, given darkness and uncertainty, becomes a dramatist. This is hardly unique to the frontier, but the frontier provided the ideal stage set. There were practical reasons to feel alert at night. Theft, though not constant, was possible in some settlements. Livestock might break loose. Embers could escape the hearth. Snow might thicken into a storm severe enough to change the next day's plans entirely. Babies could wake feverish. A cough could worsen. Winter had a habit of turning small matters into midnight matters. No one slept very far from responsibility, and yet, for all that tension, there could be deep gentleness in the evening hour. Someone hums while folding clothes. Another rubs a child's back in slow circles. A pair of hands work steadily at knitting or patching by firelight with such familiarity that the motion itself seems restful. The smell of warm milk, if there is milk, mingles with ash. Steam rises from a mug and fogs briefly in the cooler air away from the fire. You look around and see that comfort does exist here, just not in a decorative way. It is built from ritual, repetition, and human nearness. One mainstream historical fact stands firm. Before widespread artificial lighting, many households simply slept more in winter because darkness extended the night and useful light was scarce. Not everyone went straight to bed at sunset, certainly, but evening activities were often constrained by fuel, fatigue, and weather. Some historians have also discussed segmented sleep, the idea that people in earlier periods often slept in two phases with a wakeful interval between. Evidence exists, though how commonly that pattern appeared in frontier cabins remains open to debate. Human beings are rarely as tidy as theories would prefer. You lean back slightly and watch the rafters disappear into shadow above the fire glow. Smoke has marked the wood over years, leaving a dark sheen that catches the light differently from the cleaner boards below. Somewhere in those beams hangs the smell of countless suppers, damp garments, rendered fat, medicinal herbs, and winter after winter of breathed air. Cabins kept memory in the timber. The walls absorbed life quietly. At last, the tasks that can be done are done. The mending is folded away. The spoon is set aside. The last bowl is turned upside down to dry. Attention returns to the hearth for the final and important work of the evening. The fire must be prepared for the night. Larger pieces are arranged with care. Coals are gathered together. Ash may be pulled gently over the heart of the fire to preserve it until morning. This is not only routine, it is tomorrow's first comfort being negotiated in advance. The room dims further as the candle is pinched out to save what remains. Darkness rushes in at once, leaving the hearth as the only real source of light. The effect is immediate and oddly solemn. Faces become profiles, hands become outlines. The cabin contracts into a red-gold hush. You hear someone exhale, long and tired. You hear the low winter wind. You hear the stubborn, living crackle of the banked fire. And in that narrow circle of light, with the black world standing just beyond the logs, you understand what evening meant in a frontier cabin during winter. It was not merely the end of labour, it was a passage into vigilance, intimacy, imagination, and measured rest. The dark made the room smaller, but it also made every small thing matter more. A voice, a flame, a blanket, a hand on a shoulder, a fire prepared well enough to hold until dawn. Under the press of a long winter night, those modest things become immense. The next challenge arrives not with a storm or a strange sound at the wall, but with hunger returning, calm and unavoidable. On the frontier, winter eating is never a side note. It shapes the day as surely as the weather does. You feel it in your stomach before noon, in the smell of the kettle before supper, in the small private calculations people make while lifting a lid or opening a chest. Every meal asks a quiet question. How much can be used today without troubling tomorrow? You cross the cabin toward the storage corner and notice at once that food in winter has a presence of its own. It sits in crocks, sacks, barrels, boxes, hanging bags, and strings from rafters. Nothing is displayed for beauty alone. Everything has been placed to keep out damp, mice, mould, or careless feet. A ham may hang from a beam if the family has been fortunate. A sack of cornmeal rests on a chest. Dried beans wait in a crock. A little bundle of herbs is tied high near the wall, giving off a faint sharp scent when disturbed. You're looking at labour turned into survival. Many frontier diets leaned heavily on what could store well through cold months. Cornmeal, smoked pork, dried beans, salt, lard, turnips, squash, apples, and preserved fruits show up again and again in historical accounts from many regions, though exact foods varied by place, season, and culture. A family in the Ohio Valley ate differently from one in the far south, and both differed from households in French, Spanish, indigenous, or mixed settlements elsewhere. Even so, winter had a way of favouring foods that endured rather than foods that dazzled. The frontier admired practicality more than flair. You untie a sack and catch the dry, dusty smell of meal rising into the air. It clings lightly to your fingers when you scoop it. Nearby, smoked meat carries a dense, salty aroma, darker and heavier than fresh meat ever could. The smell of onions, if any remain, lies sweet and pungent under the sharper notes of wood smoke and ash. Nothing here is delicate. Frontier food announces itself plainly. It says what it is and asks no applause. Meal preparation begins with inspection. What has spoiled? What has held up? What can be stretched? A barrel is opened. A cloth is lifted. A crock lid is tilted back. You see hands moving carefully, not from fussiness but from respect. Stores that must last until thaw are treated with a seriousness most modern kitchens reserve for family heirlooms. A spilled scoop of meal is not merely annoying, it is waste. Frontier people knew waste the way sailors know reefs. They kept a wary eye on it. The fire is coaxed into the sort of steady heat that cooking likes best, and soon the room takes on that familiar evening smell of anticipation. Water warms in a kettle, a pan is set out, fat is cut from a larger piece and dropped into iron where it softens with a faint hiss. The sound is humble and beautiful. A spoon scrapes a bowl. A knife knocks gently against the board. Dinner begins not with spectacle, but with rhythm. Cornmeal is often the faithful companion of winter. It can become mush, hoe cakes, johnny cakes, pone, dumplings, or thickened stews depending on region and habit. It is not glamorous, it is reliable. You stir it with a wooden spoon and feel how quickly it changes, first loose, then thick, then heavy enough to resist. Steam rises into your face with a soft grain smell that is almost sweet. Your wrist begins to ache from stirring. Even this simple food requires effort. The frontier had very few truly effortless pleasures. Then there is pork, that famous winter staple in many settlements. Salt pork, smoked pork, pork fat rendered and saved in crocks. All of it mattered. Hogs were especially valuable on many frontiers because they could forage widely and provide meat that preserved well. A strip of pork sizzling in the pan fills the cabin with a rich scent that seems to command attention from every corner at once. Grease spits softly, the edges darken. Hunger grows bolder. This is not refined dining, but it is deeply persuasive. Beans often join the meal, or dried peas, simmered patiently until they soften enough to lose their stubbornness. If beans are on the fire, the smell is earthy and warm, almost grounding. A little onion, if one can be spared, changes everything. So does a pinch of salt. So does time. Winter cooking is full of waiting for hard things to become edible. That is a frontier lesson in more ways than one. There is a curious detail in many household histories. Pot liquor, the savoury liquid left after boiling greens or beans, was often valued and reused rather than discarded. It could flavour the next dish, soften stale bread, or simply be sipped for nourishment. Today it might be called resourceful. On the frontier it was merely common sense in an apron. Nothing tasty was allowed to wander off without permission. You begin to see that the evening meal is rarely one neat item. It is a composition built from what remains. A piece of smoked meat shaved thinner than anyone might admit. A bit of dried apple simmered until it swells again. Cornbread broken into broth. A spoonful of sorghum or molasses if the household has any left and spirits seem to require lifting. A pickle from a crock, sharp enough to wake the whole mouth. These combinations do more than feed the body. They keep monotony from settling too deeply into the mind. Monotony is one of winter's silent burdens. Even when stores are adequate, variety shrinks. You can only eat so many versions of meal and pork before imagination starts asking impolite questions. This is where small treats matter disproportionately. Preserves spread on bread, a dried peach saved for a child, a spoon of apple butter, a handful of nuts kept back for a cold evening. Comfort often arrives in tiny forms. Historians sometimes focus on scarcity, and rightly so. But there is also meaning in the modest luxuries people protected. They reveal what the heart misses, not only what the body needs. You help turn a cake in the pan and feel the heat on your knuckles. The iron gives off that dry, serious warmth that means business. The batter has crisped at the edges, and the smell now is nutty and toasted. When it is lifted free, a little steam escapes from the centre. You tear off a corner to test it and nearly burn your fingers, then your tongue. Some experiences are timeless. Frontier winter had no monopoly on impatient eating. Stored fruits tell their own story. Apples, when cellared well, could last impressively into winter. Dried apple rings might be threaded and hung. Peaches could be dried too, though they were more fragile treasures. Pumpkins and squash held on through the cold if protected from rot and freezing. In root cellars, where families had them, potatoes, turnips, carrots, and cabbages waited in darkness like buried promises. Not every cabin had a good cellar, and not every cellar performed equally well, but where storage worked, it made the difference between hardship and real distress. Scholars still debate exactly how varied frontier diets were for ordinary families, because records often come from selective sources. Memoirs may remember feast days more clearly than plain ones. Travellers' accounts sometimes emphasise novelty. Recipe books tell you what people aspired to cook, not always what they actually ate on a bitter Tuesday in February. The safest truth is also the simplest. Some households managed decent variety. Many relied on repetition. Nearly all had to improvise when winter ran long. There were plenty of improvisations. Flour ran short and meal took over. Coffee disappeared and substitutes appeared in its place. Meat grew scarce and soup got thinner. A crust became stuffing. Drippings became flavour. Bone broth stretched another day. In some places, chestnuts or hickory nuts were cracked and added to meals when available. In others, wild game or fish supplemented stores if weather, skill, and luck cooperated. Winter meals were not static. They were negotiations. One mainstream fact from frontier food history is beyond dispute. Preservation was everything. Smoking, salting, drying, pickling, fermenting, and storing in cool spaces made winter possible for countless households. Fresh food still appeared now and then through hunting, trapping, fishing, or occasional butchering, yet preserved food formed the backbone of the season. Without it, a cabin could look sturdy and still be terribly vulnerable. Walls keep out wind, food keeps out collapse. You watch someone open a crock of pickled vegetables, and the sudden vinegary scent slices through the smoky cabin air like a sharp opinion. It wakes the nose at once. Pickling preserved cucumbers, cabbage, beans, beets, and other produce in many regions and traditions, adding sour brightness to otherwise heavy winter fare. That brightness mattered. A body living for weeks on salted meat and grain was grateful for contrast, even if it arrived with enough tang to make the eyes widen. There is also the matter of bread, always dear, always complicated. Flour was prized, but not always plentiful. Where wheat could be grown or bought, biscuits, loaves, and pies might appear more often. Where it could not, cornmeal bore much of the burden. Bread on the frontier was not one fixed thing. It might be coarse or fine, risen or flat, baked in a reflector oven, on a griddle, in a Dutch oven, or directly on a hearthstone under certain conditions. However it came to table, it rarely lingered long. As the meal comes together, the cabin feels fuller. Steam clouds the cooler air near the window. The smell of food settles into clothing and hair almost as quickly as smoke does. Wooden bowls are set out. Tin cups catch the firelight. Someone tastes the pot and adds the smallest extra pinch of salt with an expression that suggests moral seriousness. Winter has a talent for making seasoning feel consequential. When at last you sit to eat, you notice how much the body responds before the mind catches up. Warmth from the bowl reaches your hands. Your shoulders loosen a little. The first bite is not merely flavour, it is relief. The meal may be plain, but it is hot, and in winter that matters enormously. A spoonful of bean stew with pork broth, a wedge of corn cake crumbling at the edge, soft onions if fortune has smiled. Every mouthful announces that work has become fuel again. Conversation around the table, if it comes, often changes tone when people are eating. There is a short, blessed quiet at first. Then comments begin. This meat kept well. The beans needed another handful. The meal sack feels lighter. The apples are going soft. The trapline may need checking. Someone jokes that the Johnny cake could patch a roof. Another answers that at least a roof patch would be useful. Frontier humour, as ever, prefers dryness. It goes well with salt pork. A quirky tidbit appears in some recollections of winter suppers. Children were sometimes given bread soaked in warm milk, broth, or grease as an easy, filling comfort food. It was soft, simple, and deeply satisfying in a cold cabin. There is something moving about that image, not because it is grand, but because it is so plain. History often survives in modest gestures. A spoon dipped, bread torn, bowl passed. Meals could also carry memory. Certain dishes belong to regions people had left behind. Corn dodgers from one family line, dumplings from another, cabbage preparations from German settlers, porridges and puddings with roots in older European habits, indigenous food knowledge woven into local survival in ways settlers did not always acknowledge fairly. Frontier cuisine was not a single tradition. It was many traditions meeting weather, scarcity, and adaptation at the same table. You notice the textures more closely as you eat. The grainy softness of mush, the chew of smoked meat, the creamy interior of beans cooked long enough, the crisp edge of a cake lifted from iron, the pleasing sting of pickled vegetables. A dried apple stewed back toward tenderness still keeps a little resistance at the centre. Winter meals are honest in the mouth. They do not pretend to be more delicate than they are. Even the leftovers matter, and bones may be saved for broth. Grease is carefully kept. Crumbs are brushed together. A heel of bread waits for breakfast. The pot is not simply emptied and forgotten. It is studied. What remains becomes tomorrow's possibility. This unromantic attentiveness sits at the core of frontier eating. Abundance could happen briefly after harvest or a successful hunt, but winter taught people to think in continuations. Supper begins with breakfast still watching from the corner, and yet, for all the prudence, small pleasure keeps finding a way in. A little sweetness on a spoon, a second helping when there is enough. The deep contentment of a hot mouthful while wind rubs at the cabin wall. The glow that moves through your chest as the food settles. The room is smoky, the benches are hard, the table is plain, and still the moment feels generous. Hunger has that effect. So does effort. When the bowls are nearly empty and the fire lowers to an easier burn, you realise what winter meals in a frontier cabin truly offer. Not luxury, not endless choice, not polished elegance. They offer steadiness. They turn stored harvests, smokehouse labour, careful preservation, and stubborn ingenuity into another lived day. They remind everyone in the room that survival is not one heroic act. It is 1,000 plain ones, ladled, sliced, stirred, and shared. In the middle of winter, that is nourishment of the deepest kind. When the bowls are cleared and the last useful task has been set aside, the cabin turns towards sleep with none of the soft ceremony modern bedrooms like to imagine for themselves. There is no cool linen sheet waiting with crisp confidence, no plumped mattress making promises it cannot possibly keep. Sleep in a frontier cabin during winter is practical, negotiated, and slightly suspicious from the very start. You do not so much drift into bed as prepare for a minor campaign against the cold. The room feels different once people begin arranging themselves for the night. Daytime objects shift purpose, benches are moved, a trundle is pulled out, blankets are shaken. Straw ticks are patted into a shape that suggests optimism more than comfort. The fire is watched again, because everyone knows that whatever warmth the cabin holds now will slowly thin through the hours ahead. Night asks the body to trust what the hearth has been left to do. Sometimes that trust is well placed. Sometimes it is rather ambitious. You go to the bed and press a hand against the cover. The top layer feels cool, almost unfriendly. Bedding in winter often held the chill of the room until human warmth gradually persuaded it otherwise. Sheets, where they existed, might be linen and sharply cold at first touch. Blankets of wool carried a rougher texture, scratchy but welcome. Quilts, if a household had them, could make all the difference, trapping pockets of air and mercy together. Yet even good bedding did not erase the first unpleasant truth. A winter bed in a frontier cabin generally had to be warmed by bodies, not by magic. Mattresses themselves were an exercise in acceptance. Feather beds could be wonderfully soft, but they were costly and not universal. More commonly, people slept on ticks stuffed with straw, corn husks, leaves, wool scraps, or whatever material the household had available. Straw had a dry, grassy smell and a tendency to shift into lumps. Corn husks made a rustling sound every time you moved, as if the bed objected to your turning over. Feathers, when they could be had, required care and sometimes flattened into strange topography. Whatever filled the tick, you became acquainted with it by touch. Frontier sleep offered intimacy with materials whether you wished for it or not. The sleeping arrangements in a one-room cabin leave very little space for personal mystery. Parents and children often slept close together. Siblings shared beds. Babies remained within easy reach. Guests, relatives, or hired hands might be accommodated on pallets, trundles, or whatever surface could be spared. Privacy in such a room was nearly non-existent, and modesty had to become flexible without disappearing entirely. Curtains were a luxury, separate chambers even more so. At night, the whole household settled into a shared geography of breathing, shifting blankets, and subdued voices. A mainstream fact of frontier domestic life is that bed sharing was common, and not simply from sentiment. It conserved space, bedding, and warmth. Human bodies gave off heat, and in winter that mattered. Children tucked beside one another under blankets became a kind of small furnace. Even adults benefited from close sleeping in cold weather. Modern habits often treat solitary sleep as the ideal default, but the frontier was not taking modern votes on comfort. It was interested in results. Before anyone fully lies down, there is a final round of preparation that reveals how hard one rest truly is. Boots may be placed where they will not freeze stiff by morning, or at least where they can be found in the dark without muttered tragedy. Damp clothes are moved nearer the hearth if it seems safe. A kettle may be left with a little warmth in it. A chamber pot is positioned within reach, because no sane person wishes to cross an icy room at midnight longer than necessary. A blanket is tucked against a draughty wall. Small acts, each one slightly dull, each one deeply wise. You kneel to remove your shoes and feel the floor's cold rising through your stockings. The boards carry little stored heat now. The air lower in the room is sharper than it seemed by the fire. Your fingertips fumble at a knot because they have started to cool already. That is one of winter's meaner talents. It waits until you are almost ready to rest and then reminds you that the distance from hearth to bed may be only a few steps, but can feel like a separate climate. Some families used clever little devices to improve their odds against this nightly chill. Heated bricks or stones wrapped in cloth could be slipped under the covers before bed. Bed warmers, metal pans with lids and long handles filled with coals, were used in some households to chase the first bite of cold from the sheets. The method worked beautifully when handled well, and regrettably when handled badly. History contains many splendid examples of comfort pursued in ways that flirted politely with disaster. The smell around the sleeping area is its own mixture. Wool, dried grass from the ticking, smoke embedded in blankets, the faint clean trace of lye soap on skin or cloth, maybe the sweet sour scent of a child already half asleep. Bed stored the odours of daily life because nothing in the cabin remained untouched by the fire and the people around it. A frontier bed was not a perfumed retreat. It was a warm repository of labour, weather, and human presence. There is also sound. Always sound. The fire, though banked, still gives out a low crackle now and then. Someone coughs. Someone else clears a throat. A child mutters nonsense from the edge of dreaming. The mattress rustles as weight settles. Wind slides along the wall and finds one persistent seam with a faint whistle. These sounds do not necessarily prevent sleep. In time they become part of sleep itself. The cabin never grows silent enough to feel empty. That may have been a comfort. You lower yourself onto the mattress and feel it answer with a dip, a creak, and perhaps a discreet complaint from the ropes or frame beneath. The first contact is always cooler than you want. Then the blanket comes up, heavy and rough, and you draw it close under your chin. If there are others in the bed, their movements are instantly known. A knee here, an elbow there, a sleepy shove when someone steals more than a fair share of the covering. Bedtime on the frontier had very little room for elegant arrangements. It involved compromise, strategic tucking, and the occasional territorial dispute conducted in whispers. Scholars still argue over how much discomfort people considered normal in these settings, because memory is a slippery witness. Later recollections sometimes speak warmly of family sleeping close together, emphasizing comfort and affection. Other accounts describe hard beds, vermin, coughing, and bitter cold with blunt honesty. Both may be true. Human beings are perfectly capable of finding tenderness inside difficult conditions. They are also capable of remembering the tenderness more fondly than the stiffness. Warmth builds slowly beneath the blankets. This is the crucial patience of winter sleep. You do not expect instant relief. You wait while trapped air begins to hold heat, and the mattress surrenders some of its chill. Toes remain cold longest, naturally. Toes have a remarkable talent for feeling neglected in every century. You tuck them toward a warmer patch, perhaps against another pair under the blanket, and hope for improvement. Gradually the body stops bracing. Shoulders loosen, the jaw softens, the bed becomes bearable, then acceptable, then almost good. One quirky truth of old bedding is that cornhusk mattresses, while cheaper and common in some places, made enough noise that turning over could sound like someone wrestling a paper harvest in the dark. Imagine trying to shift quietly while the entire bed announces your decision to the room. The frontier had many varieties of discomfort, and some were unusually chatty. Children often fell asleep first, and completely. Adults took longer, not necessarily because the bed was worse for them, but because responsibility had not left with the daylight. A mother listens for a baby's breathing. A father measures the sound of the wind and wonders whether more snow has begun. Someone thinks about the woodpile. Someone else mentally counts the meal left in the sack. Winter follows people into bed through thought, even when the body is still. Illness made sleeping arrangements even more complicated. A coughing child might be kept close to the fire. An older family member with aching joints might need extra blankets. In some cabins, dried herbs, poultices, or heated cloths were used in attempts to ease symptoms at night. Chamomile, mint, horehound, and other remedies appear in household traditions across regions. Though what truly helped, and what mostly provided hope, is not always easy to separate. The line between medicine and comfort was often thin. Still, comfort has its own usefulness. You turn your head and see the room mostly by the banked glow from the hearth. It paints a dim red line on the edge of a stool, catches the iron of a hanging pot, glows softly on the nearest blanket fold. Everything else recedes into brown-black shadow. In that hush, the cabin feels both crowded and strangely tender. So many lives arranged inside one rough shell, each body trusting timber, ash, and one another to hold back the night. The physical sensations of sleeping here are exact. Your cheek against coarse cloth, the prickly edge of a wool blanket at the neck, cool air touching the tip of your nose, warmth gathering slowly at your chest, a log under the house settling with a dull sound, straw pressing faintly through the ticking, a hand, perhaps your own or someone else's, tucked under the blanket where it can keep its fingers alive until morning. Comfort is not a total condition. It is pieced together from zones. One fact often overlooked in romantic pictures of cabin life is how important proper ventilation could be, even in winter. A tightly sealed room full of smoke, damp clothing, many sleepers, and a banked fire could become stale and unhealthy. Yet letting in fresh air meant letting in cold. Families had to balance these needs imperfectly. Some cabins remained drafty enough that ventilation was unavoidable, while better-built ones still had to contend with smoke and moisture. There was no perfect formula, only constant adjustment. Night clothing varied, but many people simply slept in undergarments, shirts, shifts, caps, stockings, or some combination practical to the weather and the household's customs. Nightcaps were useful not merely for appearance in old paintings, but because keeping the head warm mattered in cold rooms. There is something faintly comic and entirely sensible about a room full of sleeping caps beneath heavy blankets, while the wind rattles the shutter. Practicality and absurdity are close cousins. A strange little tenderness appears in the way people arrange one another before sleep. A blanket pulled higher over a child, a corner tucked around an elder's feet, a brick shifted toward the coldest side of the bed, a whispered warning not to push the cover off. These are small acts, nearly invisible to history unless someone wrote them down. Yet they formed the emotional fabric of winter nights. Survival was communal, so was care. Outside, the cold continues without hurry. Snow settles, trees stand rigid beneath it. The sky clears or clouds over according to plans no one inside the cabin can control. Perhaps a fox crosses the yard. Perhaps nothing moves at all. The world beyond the walls grows harder and quieter with every hour. Inside, bodies make their own fragile climate. Sleep finally comes not because everything is ideal, but because fatigue is powerful and the body is practical. Eyes close, breathing deepens, the mind loosens its grip on chores and inventories. You drift in and out of awareness of the fire, of someone turning beside you, of the blanket's edge brushing your chin. There may be waking in the night, a cough, a child, the need to add a log, the need to answer nature in a room that suddenly feels much colder than before. Frontier sleep was rarely unbroken. Rest existed, but it often came in parcels. Even so, there is a deep and real comfort in being under covers while winter presses uselessly at the logs outside. The mattress may rustle, the blanket may scratch, the room may never become truly warm, yet the body, once settled, knows relief. Muscles ease their complaint, feet lose their sharp chill. The pulse slows. You feel protected not by luxury, but by enclosure, habit, and nearness. And that is what sleeping in a frontier cabin during winter really means. It is not a dreamy picture of rustic simplicity. It is a shared effort to hold warmth long enough for rest to do its work. It is rough fabric, crowded space, banked coals, watchful minds, and small mercies tucked under heavy blankets. The bed does not offer perfection. It offers shelter from the long cold hours and just enough comfort to make dawn possible. In winter, that is a very generous gift. Morning on the frontier does not invite you to linger under the blankets for long, because winter chores begin before comfort has finished making its case. The cabin may look still from outside, smoke rising gently into the pale air, snow laid smooth around the clearing. Everything quiet enough to suggest peace. Inside, however, the day starts with labour pressing from every direction. Winter in a frontier cabin is full of motion that leaves very little mark on the landscape and a very large mark on the body. You rise with that familiar reluctance that belongs to cold mornings. The floor bites through your stockings. Clothes feel stiff from the chill of the room. The fire must be coaxed up again, and water has to be warmed before fingers can fully forgive the night. Yet even before breakfast is properly underway, tasks are already gathering in your mind. Wood, water, ash, livestock, if there are any, feed, mending, food preparation, cleaning, drying, checking stores, repairing what yesterday wore down. Winter does not really have a pause button. It simply changes the angle of the work. The first chore often belongs to the hearth. Ash must be cleared enough to let the fire breathe. Fresh kindling has to be arranged. Larger pieces of wood are brought in, their bark dusty and cold to the touch. The poker scrapes, the shovel lifts, the coals brighten, and the whole room begins again to organise itself around heat. The smell of stirred ash rises dry and a mineral, mixed with yesterday's smoke. It catches lightly in the throat. Fire tending may seem repetitive, but on the frontier, repetition is often another name for survival. Then comes wood itself, that endless winter subject. However much sits stacked by the wall, more seems to vanish into the hearth by evening than good sense thinks reasonable. Someone must go outside to the woodpile, where the snow is packed hard with boot prints and chips frozen into the surface. The axe handle feels cold even through gloves. Splits are carried in against the chest or under an arm, leaving flecks of bark on sleeves and floorboards. The smell of fresh cut wood, sharp and a little sweet, enters with each load. Wood heat always sounds poetic until you meet the labour bill. A mainstream fact of frontier winter is simple and stern. Gathering fuel was among the largest and most relentless household tasks of the season. Even where autumn stores were good, weather, dampness, and the sheer appetite of an open hearth meant the woodpile demanded constant attention. A family that neglected fuel could have food in the cupboard and still suffer badly. Warmth was not a background condition. It was a daily achievement. Water presents another challenge, and it is rarely a small one. If there is a nearby spring, creek, or well, someone has to fetch from it through snow, slush, or ice. Buckets knock softly against one another. The handle cuts into the palm. Breath clouds ahead of your face as you step carefully over frozen ground. A well sweep creaks. A rope stiffens. Ice has to be broken at the edge of a stream or basin with a stick, axe, or boot heel. The sound of cracking ice in cold air is bright and hard, almost musical in the rudest possible way. When the water is brought inside, the pails leave damp rings on the floor. The air near them smells faintly metallic and earthy, like cold stone and iron. Water is needed for drinking, cooking, washing, cleaning, and livestock, yet every drop represents effort. Waste becomes almost offensive when you have carried it uphill with numb fingers. Frontier households learn to think of water physically, as weight and distance, not as something that merely appears when wanted. If animals are part of the homestead, their care structures the morning just as firmly as the fire does. Chickens need feed if they are still laying at all in the weak light of winter. A cow must be milked if there is a cow. Hogs, goats, or sheep require attention depending on what the family keeps. The path to the shed or pen is often slick, stamped with manure, hay, and trampled snow. The smell there is strong and immediate, a warm animal heaviness that can seem almost welcome after the sharp emptiness of outdoor cold. Frontier people often appreciated any source of warmth, even when it came wrapped in a distinctly barnyard perfume. Milking in winter is its own test of character. The stool is cold, the pail is cold, your hands are cold until the work begins. Then steam rises faintly from the animal's body into the frigid air, and the milk strikes the bucket with a fast, thin rhythm that sounds oddly cheerful. Fresh milk was valuable not only for drinking, but for butter, soft cheese in some households, and children who needed nourishment. Of course, not every family had a milk cow, and not every cow remained productive through hard weather. Frontier comfort was always unevenly distributed. Once back inside, chores continue without ceremony. Grain may need grinding by hand if the mill is distant or inaccessible. Corn must be shelled, beans sorted, meat checked for spoilage, flour or meal sacks examined for damp. A crack in the wall patched again where yesterday's cold found a new path. Rope retied, harness mended, tool handles inspected. Winter domestic life contains 1,000 forms of maintenance, each one small enough to sound dull and important enough to matter greatly. You kneel beside a basket of clothing and begin another sort of work. Laundry, even in winter, does not disappear, though it becomes far more awkward. Washing might be delayed or reduced in the deepest cold because water freezes fast and drying cloth indoors adds dampness to the cabin air. Still, socks, underthings, baby linens, towels, and rags cannot simply be wished clean by moral effort. Clothes are scrubbed in warmed water with homemade soap, twisted, rinsed, and hung near the hearth or on lines overhead. The smell of wet wool and lye soap fills the room. Steam lifts. Drips gather under hems. Every clean garment has to survive a gauntlet before it becomes useful again. One quirky detail from old household practice is that frozen laundry could sometimes be partially dried outdoors by a process of freezing first and finishing near heat later, depending on weather and region. Cloth might stiffen into shapes comic enough to cheer the grimmest person, standing or hanging as if the absent wearer had turned suddenly to linen sculpture. It sounds funny, and it is funny, right up until you are the one carrying armfuls of rigid shirts across a snowy yard. Children, unless very small or ill, are drawn into this working day at once. They gather chips for the fire, fetch eggs if there are eggs, twist yarn, wind thread, watch younger siblings, shell corn, carry small buckets, or help scatter feed. Tasks are scaled to size, but not usually eliminated. Frontier childhood in winter includes more useful labour than many modern adults would consider charming. At the same time, these chores taught competence early. A child learned what kept the household running because the household could not afford mystery. Scholars still argue about how heavily children worked in different frontier regions and households, because records vary and memory often softens the harder edges. Some accounts stress cheerful industry and family cooperation. Others reveal fatigue, harsh discipline, and responsibilities that sat heavily on young shoulders. The likely truth is broad. Some homes asked much and gave warmth in return. Others asked much and had little softness to spare. Winter did not improve bad tempers. The cabin floor never stays tidy for long. Snow melts from boots into muddy patches. Bark drops from firewood. Ash drifts where it should not. Bits of straw cling to skirts or trousers and scatter near the bed. A dropped spoon leaves grease where no grease was wanted. Brooms work daily, sometimes more than once. The scraping whisper of sweeping becomes part of the household soundtrack, as familiar as the kettle and the poker. Cleanliness on the frontier was not spotless order. It was an ongoing argument against disorder. Food preparation itself is a chore that spreads through the entire day. Even when breakfast and supper are the main hot meals, the ingredients for both demand work between them. Corn must be measured, dough mixed, roots peeled, scraps saved, broth watched, beans sorted of stones, and meat portioned with care. Nothing moves from storage to table without several hands and several decisions. You begin to realise that the phrase making a meal hides a very large amount of actual making. Repair work fills the gaps between larger demands. A loose hinge on the shutter, a cracked handle on a bucket, a broken peg in a stool, a tear in a blanket edge before it widens, a child's mitten missing part of its thumb, which is inconvenient in a way only a frontier winter can make dramatic. Needles flash in daylight, knives pare wood into shape. Twine is tied, leather is patched. Every object is expected to keep serving past the point where modern households would have shrugged and bought another. The touch of these chores stays with you. Splinters from wood, the slick chill of a wet bucket handle, the roughness of homespun cloth between finger and thumb, the sting of cold metal, the dry dust of meal, the greasy softness of rendered fat set aside in a crock. Frontier labour is tactile in a way that leaves no part of the day abstract. You do not think about survival in theory. You carry it, scrub it, chop it, stir it, and fold it. There is also the emotional work of keeping spirits from sagging. This is less visible than hauling water, yet no less real. Someone must soothe a fretful child. Someone must keep patience when tools break or weather worsens. Someone must decide whether a precious candle can be spared for evening mending, or whether eyes must simply endure until morning. In many households, women bore a particularly heavy share of this invisible management, along with the visible work, though men too carried burdens of provision, repair, and weather exposure that could grind the nerves thin. A frontier cabin in winter runs not only on labour, but on restraint. You step to the door again at midday and look out over the clearing. Snow glows pale beneath a weak sun. The world appears still enough to be sleeping. Smoke rises in a blue-grey line. Trees stand silent. It is almost absurdly peaceful to the eye. Then you turn back into the room and see the truth written everywhere. Damp mittens by the fire, a pile of wood already shrinking, a wash basin cooling near the wall, a shirt half mended, a kettle nearly empty, a child carrying chips, a bucket waiting to be refilled. Winter stillness outdoors often conceals intense movement indoors. In some places, spinning and weaving also continued through winter whenever time and light allowed. The hum of a wheel, the soft pull of fibre through fingers, the rhythm of winding and drawing, all added another layer to the cabin's daily sounds. Cloth production was not decorative hobby work for many families. It was clothing, sacks, bedding, and basic self-sufficiency in motion. The same can be said for candle making, soap making, and preserving what little fresh food remained. Chores were not extras. They were infrastructure. One of the more curious frontier realities is how many household tasks depended on weather conditions beyond anyone's control. Laundry waited on drying conditions. Butchering depended on temperatures cool enough to preserve meat. Travel to the mill or town depended on roads, snow depth, and ice. Hunting depended on tracks, luck, and daylight. Even indoor work was shaped by what the sky decided overnight. Cabin life in winter was domestic, yes, but never detached from the large landscape. By late afternoon, fatigue arrives in layers rather than all at once. Your shoulders feel the wood you carried, your wrists remember stirring and ringing, your knees notice each bend to the floor and rise again. The room smells of smoke, damp fabric, warm meal, and bodies hard at work. There is no heroic music, no glamorous glow, only the steady accumulation of tasks met one by one. This, more than any dramatic blizzard, defines frontier endurance. The frontier also produced its own little jokes about work. A person might remark that the woodpile breeds at night only to die by evening, or that socks multiply holes in the dark out of pure spite. Such humour was not frivolous. It was a release valve. When labour is repetitive and unavoidable, laughter becomes a tool almost as useful as the poker or broom. Almost. As the light starts draining from the window, you look around and see the evidence of a day spent keeping winter at bay. Water fetched, wood brought in, clothes cleaned or patched, meals prepared, animals tended, fire maintained, floor swept, supplies checked, small repairs made. None of these tasks will be finished forever. They will return tomorrow with the same calm insistence. That is the secret at the centre of winter chores in a frontier cabin. The work is never conquered. It is only kept in motion. And yet there is dignity in that motion. The cabin remains warm enough. The household is fed again. Dry things are drier, broken things less broken, empty things partly refilled. You may be tired to the bone, but the room around you proves that effort changed something real. On the frontier in winter, rest was not earned by doing one grand deed. It was earned by answering dozens of ordinary demands before darkness closed in. The snow outside may look quiet and innocent. Inside the cabin, everyone knows better. There comes a point in winter when the cabin no longer feels like a simple shelter, but like a sealed little world where every weakness in the body and every flaw in the air becomes easier to notice. A cough lingers. Eyes sting more than usual. A child's cheeks look flushed at the wrong time of day. The room smells thicker, not from one single cause, but from many small ones gathering together. Smoke, damp wool, unwashed bedding, wet boots, steam from the kettle, human breath. Frontier cabins were built to keep life in and weather out, yet in winter those goals often argued with each other. You wake to that argument almost at once. The air feels stale near the bed, warmer under the blankets and cooler above them, with a faint bitterness from the banked fire. Your throat is dry. When someone coughs across the room, the sound carries in the half-dark with uncomfortable clarity. Another cough follows, then silence. Then the tiny pop of a coal shifting in the hearth. Illness on the frontier did not need a grand entrance. It often arrived as a simple sound repeated too many mornings in a row. Smoke sits at the centre of this problem. Even a decent chimney did not guarantee clear air all day. Wind direction, damp wood, poor draught, and constant fire tending could leave a haze that lingered low under the rafters or drifted suddenly into the room when the hearth was opened. The smell is so familiar that you almost stop noticing it, until a fresh billow rolls across the cabin and your eyes water at once. Smoke has a dry taste as much as a smell, settling on the tongue and in the throat. It catches in the chest. It lives in the cloth. It announces itself in every blanket and every sleeve. A mainstream historical reality is that smoke exposure was simply part of daily life in many pre-industrial homes, and frontier cabins often had it worse because construction could be rough, chimneys imperfect, and winters long. Open hearths warmed, cooked, and lit the room, but they also filled the indoor air with particles and fumes that irritated lungs and eyes. People learned to bear it because they had to. Tolerance, unfortunately, is not the same thing as immunity. You stand near the hearth and notice how the warmth that feels so welcome also carries hidden strain. Dry heat cracks lips and roughens hands. Repeated smoke leaves eyelids sore and makes the inner corners of the eyes sting. If the room grows too damp from drying clothes and steaming pots, the air takes on a heavy softness that clings to skin and cloth in another unpleasant way. The cabin is always balancing extremes and rarely landing neatly in the middle. Then there is sickness itself, which frontier people knew very well and named in many plain ways. Colds, fevers, agues, fluxes, sore throats, lung complaints, and countless other afflictions moved through households with very little respect for anyone's schedule. In winter, close quarters made contagion harder to escape. One room means shared air, shared bowls if supplies are few, shared blankets at times, shared surfaces, shared everything. A single child's fever can alter the whole room's rhythm by noon. You see the first signs in small household shifts. A little one stays wrapped in a blanket after the others are moving. A woman feels a forehead with the back of her hand and does not like what she finds. A man clears his throat again and again while pretending it means nothing. A pot of water is kept nearer the heat. A cloth is dipped, wrung, folded, and laid ready. Illness on the frontier could seldom be isolated cleanly. It had to be managed in place, among the sleeping, cooking, mending, and all the rest of the life that refused to pause. The smell of a sick room in a cabin is very particular. Warm water, vinegar perhaps, if used for wiping surfaces or cloths, steeped herbs, sweat trapped in blankets, smoke still hanging above it all. If onions are being cooked, or broth simmered for the ill, there is that savoury scent too, trying bravely to make the room feel more normal than it is. Everything in the cabin mingles together. Health and sickness have no separate doors here. Herbal remedies and household medicine appear quickly, horehound for coughs, mint for stomach upset, willow bark in some traditions for pain, chamomile for calming, mustard plasters, onion poultices, goose-grease rubs, honey when there is honey, vinegar when there is vinegar, steam when there is no better answer. Folk practice varied widely by region, culture, and family knowledge, and many people blended indigenous, African, European, and local traditions in practical ways. Some remedies likely soothed, some may have helped modestly, some mainly gave the hands something caring to do while time decided the outcome. Scholars still disagree over the effectiveness of many household treatments, because records are uneven and symptoms were described differently from modern medical language. What one diary called a fever might refer to many illnesses. What one family praised as a cure might simply have accompanied recovery that would have happened anyway. Yet even where the medicine was uncertain, the caregiving was not. Warm broth, clean cloths, rest, and watchfulness mattered. Comfort is not a small thing when little else can be controlled. The challenge of stale air deepens when weather grows severe. Opening a door or window covering to clear smoke brings in punishing cold. Keeping everything shut protects warmth, but traps damp breath, odours, and fumes. Some cabins were so draughty that fresh air arrived, whether welcome or not. Better built ones sometimes held heat more effectively, but also held stale air longer. There was no perfect arrangement, only trade-offs. Frontier winter specialised in trade-offs. You notice moisture everywhere once illness enters the room. Damp cloths hung to dry. Steam rising from a kettle meant for inhaling or for hot drinks. Wet mittens near the fire because chores still continue. A wash basin cooling by the wall. Breath clouding slightly near the door before vanishing. Too much moisture could chill bedding, encourage mould, or make the room feel clammy. Two little left throats raw and skin-cracked. The body feels every shift in the cabin air as if personally offended by all of them. Children often suffered especially in these conditions, partly because they shared bedding, air, and constant touch, and partly because small bodies can change quickly. A child may be lively at supper and hot with fever by midnight. An infant's breathing can draw every adult eye in the room. The quiet around a sick child in a one-room cabin is different from any other quiet. Even the fire seems to crackle more carefully. Every cough becomes a message to be interpreted, though no one enjoys the guessing. A curious old practice appears in some recollections and household manuals. People sometimes hung bunches of strongly scented herbs in the belief that they would cleanse the air or ward off illness. Sage, pennyroyal, tansy, cedar, and other pungent plants appear in traditions from various places. Whether they accomplished much beyond fragrance is another matter. Still, in a smoky winter room, any scent that cut through damp wool and stale bedding probably felt at least spiritually promising. You sit by someone ill and feel the roughness of a blanket warmed by the body beneath it. The skin at the forehead is too hot, then later, too cool. A cup is lifted to dry lips. A spoon taps faintly against the rim of a bowl. These are very small sounds, but in a cabin they take on enormous weight. When one person is sick, everyone hears it. Everyone adjusts around it. Work still must be done, yet it is done with one ear turned back toward the bed. There is another form of strain that smoke and illness create, one harder to see and impossible to sweep from the floor. Nerves wear down, sleep breaks more easily, patience thins. A room full of tired people breathing bad air through a long winter can grow tense for reasons no one says aloud. The baby cries. Someone coughs again. The kettle boils over. The wood brought in is damp. A shirt left too near the hearth smells scorched. None of these things are major alone. Together they can grind at the spirit. Frontier people were not made of special iron. They worried. They snapped at each other. They grew frightened when a fever lingered or a cough deepened. They felt trapped by storms and distance and the absence of a doctor within easy reach. A physician, if one existed nearby, might be miles away over poor roads or no road at all. Payment might be uncertain. Travel in deep snow might be impossible. Many households relied first on home treatment not because it was quaint, but because alternatives were scarce. That scarcity could be terrifying when symptoms turned serious. Breathing troubles in a smoky cabin were especially alarming. A wheeze at night, a rattling cough, a child's chest working too hard, the room becomes tense at once. Someone sits up with the sick person. Someone else adds a little wood, then regrets the extra smoke. A cloth is warmed. A blanket is tucked. Time slows into listening. There are few things more helpless than hearing lungs struggle and having only simple tools in your hands. One historical fact deserves plain mention. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza, measles, whooping cough, and other infectious diseases took a heavy toll in many communities before modern medicine, and cramped winter housing could worsen exposure and recovery. Frontier isolation sometimes spared households from outbreaks for a while, then left them vulnerable when disease finally arrived. Distance protected and endangered in equal measure. It rarely chose one role for long. Even without major illness, the cabin could strain the body in quieter ways. Eyes reddened from smoke, skin split at the knuckles from cold water and lye soap. Backs ached from lifting, chopping, carrying, bending. Feet stayed damp too long inside worn boots. Poor diet late in winter could leave people more tired and less resilient. Headaches came from bad air or worry or both. Winter hardship was often cumulative. It wore people rather than always striking them dramatically. The sounds of care become their own pattern through the day. A spoon stirring broth, a kettle lid rattling, a stool drawn closer to the bed. Quiet voices conferring over symptoms. The rustle of fresh straw added to a tick if the bedding has grown foul. The swish of a broom clearing away dirty rags. At moments the room smells sharp with vinegar, then sweet with mint tea, then heavy with smoke again when the wind betrays the chimney. The senses never stop collecting evidence. One quirky frontier detail concerns onions. those humble household heroes. In some traditions, sliced onions were laid in rooms or applied in poultices for coughs and fevers, trusted to draw out illness or cleanse the air. Whether they healed much is arguable. Whether they made the room smell very decisively of onion is not arguable at all. Imagine smoke, damp wool, fever sweat, and raw onion sharing one small space. History was rarely subtle. You begin to see that keeping a winter cabin habitable required not just fuel and food, but constant management of atmosphere. Bedding had to be aired when possible, dirty cloths washed, the floor swept, ash removed, drafts reduced but not entirely smothered, wet garments dried before they soured, chamber pots emptied promptly, bodies kept as clean as weather allowed. This hidden labour sat mostly in ordinary hands, especially the hands of women, though all members of a household could contribute in some way. Health was domestic work long before it was formal medicine. There were moments of relief, certainly. A fever breaks and leaves the face cooler at last. A cough eases enough for true sleep. Fresh snow outside brightens the room with reflected light and, for a few hours, the chimney draws cleanly. Someone laughs, genuinely, after days of worry, and the sound feels almost medicinal. Recovery on the frontier could look very modest. A better appetite, less heat in the skin, a stronger voice asking for broth. Small improvements were treasured because they had to be, yet loss and lasting weakness were also part of the winter record, however gently people later described them. Some came through illness thinner, slower, and more easily winded. Some did not come through at all. It would be false to smooth that truth away entirely. Still, what stands out inside the cabin is not only danger, but the stubbornness of care. People watched, waited, fed, bathed, soothed, sat awake, tried again. The work of tenderness continued even when certainty did not. As evening gathers, the room leans once more on firelight, and the air grows thicker unless someone dares a little fresh cold in through the door. You feel the smoke sting your eyes. You feel the warmth drying your hands. You hear a cough from the bed and the soft answer of another voice right away. That answer matters. In a frontier cabin during winter, sickness could never be held entirely at arm's length. It entered the common air, so did resilience. And that is what life was really like when smoke, strain, and illness settled over a winter cabin. There was no polished separation between the healthy and the unwell, the practical and the emotional, the household and the sick room. Everything happened together in one close world of rough blankets, bitter air, herbal steam, burning wood, and tired hands. The cabin could feel crowded, stale, and anxious. It could also become, in the same hour, a place of fierce patience. In the middle of winter, that patience was often the strongest medicine anyone possessed. Then, almost against winter's wishes, a different kind of warmth begins to appear in the cabin, one that does not come from oak logs, hot broth, or a blanket tucked firmly at the feet. It comes from company, not the crowded, practical company of daily chores, but the chosen kind. A knock sounds at the door after dusk, or perhaps the latch lifts and a familiar face leans in with snow on the shoulders and a grin that says the road was unpleasant but survivable. At once the room changes. The cabin is still small, still smoky, still rough around every edge, yet now it feels larger because other voices have entered it. Winter visits on the frontier were never guaranteed. Distance, weather, and labour could keep neighbours apart for days or weeks. Roads disappeared into mud, ice, or drifts. Creeks rose. Horses tired. Nights came early. So when someone did arrive, the event carried real weight. A visitor brought news, fresh conversation, perhaps a borrowed tool, maybe a little trade, and very often relief from monotony. The frontier valued self-reliance, certainly, but no sensible person romanticized isolation for long. Once winter had settled in with its cold little opinions, you move to make room almost instinctively. A stool is pulled closer to the hearth. Wet mittens are shifted. A cup is found, then another. Snow melts from boots onto the floor and nobody minds very much. The smell of the room changes as the outdoors enters with the guest. Cold air, horse sweat perhaps, leather damp from weather, pine or cedar clinging to a coat. Then, as the visitor warms, those fresh outdoor notes begin to mingle with the cabin's familiar smoke, wool, and cooking smells. A winter visit has its own atmosphere, half weather, half welcome. The first exchange is practical. How are the roads? How deep is the snow by the creek? Has anyone heard from the mill? Is old Mrs. Turner feeling stronger? Did the Carter boy make it back from town before the storm? On the frontier, news moved by people more than paper in many places, especially in bad weather. A neighbour's voice could carry information no less valuable than food. Roads, illness, prices, births, breakages, trouble with livestock, a new family arriving, a rumour of mail, all entered the cabin by word of mouth and settled there beside the fire. A mainstream historical truth of frontier life is that neighbours mattered enormously. Even fiercely independent households relied on networks of exchange, help, warning, and companionship. People lent tools, shared labour at harvest or butchering, watched each other's children, helped raise cabins, and checked on one another during illness or severe weather when distance allowed. Winter did not erase those ties. If anything, it clarified their worth. Self-sufficiency sounded noble. A nearby friend with a strong back and a sensible mind sounded better. The sounds of the room begin to layer in a different way. Voices overlap. Someone laughs before finishing a sentence. A chair leg drags. A cup is set down with a hollow wooden tap. The fire punctuates the talk with little cracks and sighs. A child, who had been drooping with boredom only minutes earlier, wakes into sudden brightness because company means novelty. Even the adults sit a little differently. Shoulders unclench. Faces lift toward one another instead of only toward work. It is remarkable what a single visitor can do for the air in a winter cabin. You notice how quickly hospitality takes shape even when supplies are limited. A guest is offered the warmest place near the hearth, a cup of something hot if possible, perhaps a share of whatever food is in the pot. Frontier generosity was not always abundance. Often it was measured sacrifice. A family that had little still understood the social necessity and moral expectation of offering what comfort it could. Refusing a weary traveller at the door in severe winter was no small matter. Conditions taught people where duty began. Stories start easily once the first practical matters are done. A hunting tale, perhaps improved slightly in the retelling. A mishap with a mule. A remark about a man upriver who insists on planting too early every year and then acts surprised when frost insults him again. Human beings do not wait for easy centuries to invent humour. Frontier jokes were often dry, local, and built from hard experience. They made fun of weather, tools, stubborn animals, vanity, and the sort of blunders that everyone understood because everyone had committed some version of them. Children edge closer when storytelling begins. Their eyes reflect the firelight. A blanket wrapped around narrow shoulders slips and is pulled up again without them noticing. They listen hard, not merely for entertainment, but because stories carry maps of how the world works, which creek freezes early, which path becomes dangerous in drifted snow, which neighbour once got lost and followed his own tracks for an hour before realising the frontier was mocking him personally. Anecdotes on the frontier often smuggled instruction inside amusement. It was an efficient system. Then there are songs. Not always, not in every household, and not necessarily in polished voices. But songs do appear in many recollections of winter evenings. A hymn, a ballad, a folk song brought from another country, a nonsense rhyme for children, a lullaby softened by fatigue. In a small cabin, even one voice singing can alter the whole room. The sound presses gently against the logs and seems to fill corners the firelight cannot reach. The smell of smoke remains. The chill at the wall remains, yet music threads through them and changes the feeling of both. A quirky little frontier detail is that homemade instruments often made appearances when available. A fiddle if someone owned one and knew enough to coax a tune from it. A Jew's harp twanging in the half-light. Bones clicked for rhythm, a whistle. Even a table edge tapped in time. Not every gathering became a concert, of course, but people used what they had. A winter evening did not require elegance to become memorable. It only required enough spirit to push back at the dark for a while. You sit with a mug, warming your hands, and feel how different this warmth is from labour's warmth. It is not the heat of hauling water or chopping wood. It is the inner ease that comes when attention turns from necessity to companionship. The bench is still hard. The room is still crowded. A draught still brushes your ankle from somewhere near the wall. Yet none of it seems so severe when someone nearby is describing a foolish horse or an overconfident trapper with dramatic eyebrows. Games, too, found their place in winter cabins when conditions and temper allowed. Simple card games, if cards were owned, guessing games, riddles, word games, contests of memory or nonsense. Children might play little hand games or use scraps, pegs, kernels, or stones for amusement. Adults were not above joining in, especially after the heaviest chores were done. Leisure on the frontier was rarely separated from whatever materials happened to be at hand: a smooth pebble, a string, a deck worn soft at the edges, and an hour by the fire could be enough. Scholars still debate how much leisure time frontier households actually had in deep winter, because surviving accounts differ sharply by class, region, weather, and household condition. Some memoirs describe lively evenings of singing and visiting. Others emphasize exhaustion so complete that people wanted only food and bed. The truth almost certainly shifted from one week to the next. Human communities are not machines. They bend with circumstances. A family with enough fuel and food might laugh freely on a clear night. The same family under illness or scarcity might sit in near silence the next evening. The smell of something small and pleasant sometimes marks these social nights. Apples warming near the hearth, a cake of cornmeal crisping a little extra at the edge, molasses stirred into hot water, even popcorn in some places, when corn and a suitable variety were available, though not every household enjoyed that treat. The scent of such things lifts spirits out of proportion to the ingredients involved. Winter teaches the senses to be grateful for very modest luxuries. You hear a neighbour lower their voice and share news not meant for broad shouting. A family farther west may be leaving in spring. Someone's daughter is expected to marry. A traveller reported seeing more wagons on the road. A preacher may come through next month if the weather allows. These scraps of news matter because they connect the cabin to a wider human world. In winter, it is easy for a family to feel reduced to wood, food, and weather. Conversation reminds them they still belong to a community, to change, to events beyond the snow around their own door. Sometimes visitors come not only for cheer, but from need, a borrowed measure of meal, help dressing a wound, advice about a cough, assistance with a broken sled runner, a place to warm up before continuing on. Community in winter had practical edges. Kindness and necessity often shared the same coat. You might pour hot broth for a guest while also asking whether they have seen your stray calf or heard if the road to town is passable. Sentiment and logistics rarely lived far apart. A child's delight can become the centre of the room on such nights. Perhaps a visitor brings a small gift, a carved whistle, a bit of ribbon, a sweet saved from town, a story of some place the child has never seen. The object may be trivial in money and enormous in effect. Eyes widen. Fingers turn it over with reverence. For a few minutes, the whole hard machinery of winter loosens. Wonder has entered the cabin wearing muddy boots and a very ordinary hat. There is also the particular pleasure of hearing old tales repeated by someone who tells them well. Family legends, courtship stories polished by time, accounts of storms, journeys, strange animals, foolish bargains, mysterious lights, near misses, lucky escapes. Some stories grow in the telling. This is a human law older than the frontier. Still, exaggeration performed a useful service. It turned hardship into narrative, and narrative is easier to live with than raw discomfort. A freezing ride becomes an adventure once survived. A disaster with a pig becomes comedy once the pig has lost. The firelight helps all of this. It softens faces, deepens pauses, and gives each speaker a kind of small stage. Hands move through the glow, steam rises from cups, shadows lean and withdraw on the wall behind the teller. The cabin becomes a theatre with the one set, one lighting design, and a very limited ticket supply. No one seems to mind. You realize how much winter sociability depends on voice. In thin light, the voice carries mood, wit, memory, and affection all at once. One historical reality often overlooked is that loneliness itself was a serious burden in isolated places. Diaries and letters from many eras reveal the emotional toll of confinement, distance, and repetitive labour. Companionship was not an optional decorative extra. It helped preserve morale, especially through long winters when travel was difficult and daylight brief. A visitor could interrupt despair simply by arriving with new words and a laugh that belonged to another household. The touch of shared life appears in small gestures all evening. A hand on a shoulder during a joke. A blanket shifted so two children can fit beneath it together. A bowl passed. A mitten held near the fire by someone else while its owner talks. Such gestures are easy to miss because they are ordinary. But history is often built from ordinary tenderness more than heroic speeches. At times the talk turns serious. Prices, sickness, weather signs, church matters, politics in a broad and distant sense, land disputes, the behaviour of officials, the risks of travel, the fear of crop failure next year if spring comes late. Winter evenings could hold anxiety as easily as laughter. People did not become cheerful puppets simply because they were gathered around a hearth. They were full citizens of worry, hope, pride, resentment, and curiosity, just as people are now. The difference is that the room was smaller and the stakes often felt nearer. Then, as the hour deepens, the mood softens again. The youngest children slip towards sleep. A song slows. Someone stretches and remarks that the road home will not shorten itself. Cloaks are shaken out, boots are tugged back on. The door opens, and the cold comes in once more, brisk and immediate, carrying the smell of snow and night. Farewells are said with that frontier blend of warmth and practicality. Come again when weather permits. Tell your wife we asked after her. Mind the drift by the creek. If the storm worsens, turn back. When the door closes and the room settles, the cabin feels smaller again, yet not as lonely as before. Laughter seems to hang in the rafters for a while. The air still smells of extra wool, melted snow, and the faint remains of a treat shared out carefully. A child smiles in sleep. An adult repeats one of the jokes under their breath and shakes their head. Company leaves a residue more pleasant than smoke. And that is one of the quiet truths of winter life in a frontier cabin. Survival did not depend on food and fire alone. It also depended on those brief pockets of fellowship that kept the mind from narrowing into pure endurance. A knock at the door. A story made better in retelling. A hymn. A riddle. A borrowed cup. A little laughter around a smoky hearth. These were not distractions from frontier life. They were part of how people remained fully human inside it. When the dark was long and the snow went on, that kind of warmth could carry a household farther than anyone outside the cabin might guess. By late winter, the cabin begins to feel as if it has been holding its breath for months. The logs still stand firm, the hearth still burns, the roof still wears its burden of frost and snow, yet everything inside carries the look of a season stretched thin. Meal sacks are lighter when lifted, candles are shorter. The woodpile, no matter how carefully judged, suddenly seems too small each time you glance at it. Blankets smell more deeply of smoke than ever. Boots show new cracks. Even the people in the room move with a different kind of economy now. Not the energetic urgency of early winter, but the measured effort of those who have been answering the same demands for a very long time. This is the hardest stretch, not always because it is the coldest, though sometimes it is, but because patience has worn down to its final threads. You wake to another pale morning, another kettle to warm, another floor cold underfoot, another fire to coax, another sky that cannot yet be trusted. Hope is no longer a bright thing. It is a stubborn one. You do not expect beauty from the season at this point. You expect endurance. The cabin reflects that endurance in every object. A chair has been mended twice and now leans with the humble dignity of furniture that knows it is overworked. A mitten has so many patches it looks like a family argument resolved by needle and thread. The meal chest opens with a drier sound than it did earlier in the winter. A broom of bundled twigs has thinned at one end from daily scraping across the floor. Nothing is fresh. Everything is still useful. That distinction matters. You step outside for a moment and feel the quality of the cold has changed, though only slightly. It is still sharp in the lungs, still able to sting the eyes and tighten the skin across the face. Yet somewhere underneath, there is a hint of looseness in the air. The snow at the edge of the roof glitters in a new way. Water may have dripped yesterday and frozen again by night. A dark branch shows through on a distant tree. Perhaps a bird calls once, perhaps not. Late winter is full of false promises, and the frontier teaches you not to trust them too quickly. Inside, the smell of the room has deepened into a season-long record of a life. Smoke in the rafters, wool in the blankets, dried herbs hanging nearly spent, stored roots carrying their earthy sweetness, iron warmed over and over at the hearth, damp leather drying for the 100th time. The cabin holds these smells like pages hold the ink. They are the air of persistence. A mainstream truth of frontier life is that many households found the end of winter more difficult than the beginning. Supplies ran lower, preserved food lost variety, animals might be thinner, roads remained uncertain. Physical fatigue had accumulated for months. The cheerful discipline of autumn preparation had long since been replaced by plain necessity. Surviving until spring was not poetic. It was arithmetic with weather in the room. You open the food stores and see the arithmetic clearly. The barrel is not empty, but it is not comfortably full. Dried beans remain, though fewer than one would like. The smoked meat hangs smaller and harder. Apples in storage have gone soft or spotted and must be used quickly if at all. A turnip pulled from the cellar bin has begun to wrinkle. Flour, if any remains, is guarded like treasure. Cornmeal takes the lead again, loyal and plain. Hunger has not become dramatic. It has become watchful. Meals in this season carry a quieter mood. The body still needs hot food, perhaps more than ever, yet the table feels more careful. Portions are studied, broth is stretched, scraps are reused with admirable creativity. A handful of beans in the pot seems somehow more significant now. A spoonful of molasses can feel like a moral event. The smell rising from the kettle is comforting, but also sobering. It says there is supper tonight. It does not guarantee much beyond that. There is a curious emotional tension in these late winter days. The mind leans forward towards spring while the body remains trapped in winter routine. You find yourself scanning the edges of the world for signs, a muddy patch by the door, a softening in the path, slight dripping from the eaves at noon, a change in the animal sounds outside, chickens more restless, a cow shifting differently in the stall. The possibility of thaw begins to haunt the senses, yet the frontier punishes impatience. Warmth at midday can become a hard freeze by evening. Meltwater turns to dangerous ice overnight. A week of promising weather can be followed by a storm fierce enough to remind everyone who still rules the season. Historians and weather diaries alike show that late winter and early spring often brought some of the most frustrating uncertainty for rural households. The calendar whispered one thing. The sky often answered with another. This uncertainty affects work around the cabin. There is still wood to split, but not quite the same confidence about how much will be needed. There are repairs to make, yet people also begin turning their minds toward coming tasks outside. Tools are checked for ploughing, planting, fence mending, ditch clearing. Seed stores are inspected if seed exists to inspect. A harness may be patched with spring labour in mind. Hope, even when cautious, starts doing practical things with its hands. You sit at the table and sort a small pile of seed with careful fingers. Each kernel or bean feels dry and smooth, almost insignificant. And yet here, in this one gesture, lies the next season's gamble. Too little seed, and the year's future narrows. Too much eaten in hunger, and the spring fields suffer. Too much saved while the family grows weak and the trade becomes cruel in another direction. Scholars still debate how often frontier families had to consume seed stores in severe years, because evidence is uneven and local conditions mattered enormously. But the fear of that choice lived widely enough to leave a mark in memory. The body in late winter feels different too. Strength is not gone. But it is less careless than before. Hands are more cracked, shoulders ache sooner. A cough that began as nothing may still linger, as winter habits do. Skin has known too much cold water, too much dry heat, too much lye soap, too little ease. Children seem at once larger and thinner. Adults move with that practiced efficiency, which can look almost calm from a distance, and is often simply fatigue wearing decent manners. Even the firelight has a different mood now. It still warms the room, still catches the eye and brightens faces at dusk. Yet its glow seems to fall on people who have learned everything the season wanted to teach. They do not waste motion. They do not waste fuel. They do not waste much speech either. Late winter has stripped away all decorative habits. What remains is useful, durable, and honest. There is, however, one odd little comfort that appears in this season. Sunlight, when it comes, feels warmer simply because you have missed it so much. A shaft of pale afternoon light through the window can land on the table and seem nearly luxurious. You hold your hand in it and feel almost nothing physically, yet the mind takes heart anyway. Human beings are wonderfully susceptible to a little brightness. Frontier cabins understood this very well. A quirky tidbit from old accounts is the way people watch signs in nature with intense seriousness, sometimes mixing close observation with inherited folklore. The height of certain bird flights, the behaviour of squirrels, the smell of the air at dawn, the pattern of frost on window surfaces, all could be treated as clues. Some signs had practical basis. Others belonged more to tradition than science. Still, in a world where weather governed work so completely, paying attention became almost a moral discipline. You begin to hear different sounds outside on certain days. Not many, not reliable, but enough to stir the imagination. A drip from the roof, a wet thud as a little snow slides from a branch, the sharper call of a bird, water under ice somewhere far off, faint but moving. Then a gust comes hard from the north, and everything snaps back into winter at once. Late winter likes to tease. It is not above a little cruelty. Inside the cabin, mood shifts along with these signs. One moment everyone is practical and silent, heads bent over chores. The next, someone mentions the creek may open soon, or the lower road might be passable in another week, and suddenly the room lifts. Spring talk enters cautiously. Garden plots, seed time, washing blankets properly at last, fresh greens, longer days, travel to town, a visit postponed all winter. The frontier trained people to think ahead because looking ahead was one of the few luxuries not taxed by weather. Yet those hopes are fragile. A storm can arrive and push them back into their corners. Wind rattles the shutter, snow needles against the door. The room darkens in the middle of afternoon. Another armful of wood must be carried in, another kettle of water heated, another supper made from the same shrinking stores. You discover that the final lesson of the season is not romance, but repetition handled bravely. One historical fact remains constant across many frontier regions. Spring itself could be dangerous. Thaw meant mud deep enough to trap wagons, swollen streams, collapsing roads, spoiled stores, damp bedding, and sickness stirred up by changing weather. People longed for it and feared parts of it at the same time. The end of winter was not a clean doorway. It was a wet, complicated threshold. You stand at the open door one noon and smell it. Not spring exactly, but the faint dark scent of earth beneath the snow. It rises only for a moment, mixed with wet bark and cold air, then disappears as the wind turns. Yet that brief smell changes the whole afternoon. The body notices. The mind notices even more. Beneath the crust of winter, something is preparing to move again. A child sees a patch of bare ground near the wall and points as if a miracle has appeared. In a sense, one has. A hen clucks more energetically. The horse in the yard tosses its head at a scent on the air. Mud begins forming where everyone least wants it, proving that hope is not always tidy. The cabin floor records the seasons change immediately. Less powdered snow, more wet clay, less crunch outside, more sucking sound underfoot. Spring rarely enters politely. Late winter is also when people begin taking stock of what the season cost, how much food was used, which clothes survived, which tools failed, who grew stronger, who did not, which part of the roof must be mended first, whether the chimney needs new attention, whether the fence line can be saved. Households reviewed these things not as an intellectual exercise, but because another year depended on learning from them. The frontier was a stern teacher, but it did permit retests. You may hear more talk of travel now. Someone must eventually go to market, to church, to a neighbour, to fetch supplies, to carry news. Distances that felt impossible in deep snow begin to feel merely difficult. Wheels may soon turn again. Hooves may find road instead of drift. This promise of movement changes the cabin almost as much as actual warmth does. Winter confinement has a mental weight. The thought of passage lifts it. Still, the nights remain cold. The fire must still be banked. Blankets still gather at the chin. Drafts still move quietly along the floor. The cabin knows better than to celebrate too early. So do the people in it. Hope here is not loud. It glows low, like coals carefully kept alive. And that, perhaps, is the finest image of the season's end. Not a sudden blaze of joy, but a bed of coals refusing to die. The family has done the same. Day after day they have fed the fire, mended the clothes, stretched the meal, carried the water, soothed the sick, endured the dark, and watched the sky. No grand trumpet announces such persistence. It happens in silence, in smoke, in ordinary acts repeated until they become a kind of victory. Now, as the light lingers a little longer in the evening and the roof drips once, then again, the cabin feels less like a fortress under siege and more like a vessel that has almost reached shore. Not safely yet, not entirely, but almost. The season has not been defeated in any dramatic way. It has simply been outlasted. So you sit nearer the hearth as dusk settles and listen to the small sounds of a household still intact. A spoon against a bowl, a child breathing evenly, a chair creaking under tired weight. The wind less severe tonight, or perhaps only less frightening. The smell of smoke softer now. The floor still rough beneath your feet. Nothing has become luxurious. Everything has become precious. And with that feeling settled low and steady in the room, the long winter finally begins to loosen its grip. The fire burns lower now, not with danger, but with a gentler, breathing glow. You let your eyes rest on it, and the room seems to soften around the edges. The rough logs no longer look severe. They look faithful. The patched blanket across your knees feels heavy in the kindest way. Somewhere outside, snow still lies over the ground. But in the quiet you can imagine it sinking little by little beneath tomorrow's pale light. You do not need the season to end all at once. It is enough, in this moment, to feel that it will end. The kettle gives one faint murmur. A coal shifts with a soft red wink. The cabin holds its warmth close, like a secret carefully kept. The air smells of ash, wool, and the last of the evening meal. And all of it feels familiar enough to trust. Your hands, worn by cold water and wood and work, finally grow still. Your shoulders ease. The mind loosens its hold on counting and planning. Outside, the dark stretches across the clearing, calm and deep, but it no longer feels endless. Beneath the snow there is earth. Beyond the cold there is rain. Beyond the bare branches there will be leaves again, though there is no need to hurry them. For now, the cabin is enough. The hearth is enough. The small circle of warmth, the hush of tired breathing, the low firelight on old wood, all of it settles around you like a final blanket. You listen to the night without fear. You listen to the cabin without effort. And as the last embers glow softly in the dark, the long winter drifts at last into stillness.